Chapter 334. Along the way, they seemed to have finally entered the interior of the country of fog. After breaking through the snowstorm outside, there was no fog inside, but the sky was gray regardless of day or night. It was difficult to see the sun or the stars. Is it because it's called a country of fog? Huaisha was curious. Why not call it the country of yarn? It's more appropriate. I feel that if it's called the country of yarn, that such a gidge will die again. Don't play with homonyms, okay? Huaisha sighed and looked around. There were ruins everywhere. He originally thought that he could play the role of a little monster and scare the innocent residents. As a result, there were many cities and villages along the way, but there was not a single living person. It seemed that there had been a war or something else. There were ruins everywhere, and no one was there. They saw a lot of dead people. Whether it was rotten things or corpses that had been hung on the collapsed city walls and turned into stinking bacon, they were not the appearance that humans could have. Instead, they were more like some kind of humanoid hybrid of lizard and snake, and most of them had extremely serious distortion and mutation. As for the other strange beasts and creatures, they were almost used to it. There were too many. There was one every few steps. If it weren't for Huaisha's body still having some deterrence and Fu Yi's wide-area illusion, they didn't know how much trouble they would have encountered along the way. Now it was basically Huaisha rushing, Fu Yi sleeping, waking Fu Yi up when there was trouble, activating the illusion and rushing a wave, and after that, Fu Yi went back to sleep to recover her mana. She was getting fatter and fatter, but Huaisha didn't dare to say it. How long has it been since we came in? Fu Yi lay in the basket under Huaisha's neck and asked in boredom. It should be 2 or 3 weeks, right? If it's counted by days, it's been more than half a month. Huaisha replied, but my body sense should only last for a week, and the real time is definitely not more than 8 hours. The witch's night could only last for 8 hours. Although they didn't know what kind of law and distance was used, there was no doubt that the time here was accelerated. It sounded incredible, but it was actually the case. It was like a special setting in a novel. You just have to get used to it. After so many years in the present realm, in the framework established by the Creator one after another, time had become something that could be easily manipulated. This was especially true after several upgrades, including the theory of relativity and other related plugins. As long as there was enough origin substance to operate, the flow of time in an enclosed space could be fast or slow to a shocking degree. The only regrettable thing was that even though the fast-forward function had been installed for so long, the fast-rewind function was still far away. Even the pause function was so difficult to operate that the creator of the physics specialty would explode his brain. Research in this field was too dangerous and had been completely sealed by the Academy of Astronomy from the source of the Silver Sea. In the end, to some extent, the loss of entropy was not irreversible. It just depended on how much one had to pay. Even if it was a small-scale time reversal, it was still a terrifying consumption that would deepen the depth of the entire reality. Of course, there were rumors that this technology had been abused by yesterday's Express. Some people also said that the Rainbow Bridge, one of the 3 major blockades in the present realm, could not only teleport people back in time, but could even teleport people back a month or something. No one would believe this kind of sensationalist nonsense. It made people want to laugh when they heard it. Ha! Huaisha laughed. Fu Yi raised her head and looked at him. What are you laughing at? Huaisha pondered for a moment and replied dryly. I remembered something happy. What happy thing? Huaisha certainly couldn't talk about the secrets that Crow had told him in private. He could only say after a long pause, someone's wife is going to have a baby. What a coincidence, my mother is also going to have a baby. Fu Yi asked curiously. Do you think we're talking about the same person? Sorry. Huaisha could only bow his head and admit his mistake. It's okay, I'm joking. Fu Yi glanced at him and responded lightly. She was not angry and just retracted back in the basket. Be careful, it's going to rain. As if to prove her speculation, there was a sudden thunder in the sky. At dusk, the dim light of the setting sun couldn't be seen. Instead, the sky was quickly covered by dark clouds. Then, a stinky rainstorm quickly poured down. It fell on the ground with a sizzling sound. The concentration is terrifying to this extent. If it was in the present realm, all the acid rain would cry out, right? Huaishir raised his eyes and looked at the dark sky in the distance. The acid rain fell on his carapace and scales as if it had fallen on a stone. After leaving faint traces, it was shaken off without a trace. It had no effect. Since entering here, Huaishir's body had grown bigger. Now, it had surpassed the size of an ambulance and was approaching the size of a small truck. If it continued to grow, it wouldn't be the same size as a heavy truck one day, right? Huaishir would occasionally think about this when he was eating. Then, he seriously considered dieting for a few seconds and quickly threw it to the back of his mind. F***CK. I'll get bigger if I get bigger. Sponsor partnerships are more important. He opened his mouth and took a mouthful of rainwater that was like a strong acid. After rinsing his mouth and washing away the stains on his teeth, he skillfully spat it out casually. This was the good thing about having a high physique. He was immune to all poisons, and attacks of any attribute were not weak. Although his health bar was thick enough and his defense was high enough, his arms and legs were short and he didn't have much control. However, the advantage of being able to travel in the rain like now was something that other explorers didn't have. In the past 2 days, when he was free, he had replaced Fu Yi's bamboo basket with an iron one and hung it around his neck with a lock of sorrow. It was clearly the size of a basketball, but hanging around his neck was like a small bell with an opening at the top. Well, it was becoming more and more like a dog. Just as he was lost in his imagination, his footsteps suddenly came to a halt. He stopped in front of the abyss. The mud and acid rain converged into a turbid current that flowed past his feet and fell into a huge crack that had inexplicably appeared in the ground. The crack was thousands of meters long, and the narrowest part was hundreds of meters wide. It was as if a violent earthquake had occurred, and the Earth's crust had undergone violent changes. He could vaguely see the ancient city that had been half submerged in mud at the bottom of the trench. The dried bones slowly rose and fell in the acid rain and turbid flow, and soon sank into the depths of the mud. That's great. We don't even need a mass cemetery. Huaishir clicked his tongue and sighed. How do you make such a horrifying scene sound like a market? Fu Yi sighed. Of course it's through talent. Huaishir's wolf mouth skillfully curled up and whistled proudly. I'm super brave. What's there to be afraid of? Is that so? The stoat in the bell basket said expressionlessly, then looked back. Then Huaishir took a step back and rushed straight forward. You step. Look back for what? As early as when Fu Yi said to look back, Huaishir felt a premonition of death suddenly erupt in his heart, piercing his soul to the point that it trembled. Regardless of everything, he rushed forward with all his strength. Risking falling into the abyss of the crack, he ran wildly out. There was a roar. As if a small bubble had burst out, a crisp sound was drowned out by the sound of the torrential rain. Then, the acid rain was lifted, as if a door had suddenly opened between the curtains. It was pushed to the sides by the repulsion of psychokinesis. The psychokinesis rolled up a hurricane and applied to Huaishir's body, providing him with instant acceleration. The giant wolf had already dragged a section of the iron pillar, broke through the air, leaped through the crack in the air, and jumped out to the other side. Vaguely, he felt as if something had touched his hind leg. It was cold to the bone, and then the pain that went deep into the bones suddenly erupted. His body suddenly twitched, and his center of gravity was unstable. He almost fell into the abyss. Step! Fu Yi's roar exploded in his ears. Huaishir had no doubts. His front paw slapped down in the void, as if he had slapped on a rock, and was lifted up by psychokinesis. He finally staggered and landed on the other side of the crack. What was shocking was that after leaving the other side of the crack, the torrential rain also magically disappeared. They could even see the remnants of the setting sun here. The air was dry, and the ground was solid. At this moment, Huaishir felt the phantom pain on his hind leg slowly dissipate. He panted violently, and saliva fell from his mouth. He asked blankly, "What's going on?" "I was going to ask you what's going on." The stoat holding the sharp horn on his forehead lowered its head and looked into his eyes, unable to contain its anger. Why didn't you respond to me, no matter how I called you? If it weren't for the last jump, we would be dead. I, I heard you tell me to look back. Huaishur panted in fear and felt the chill on his back finally dissipate. If it weren't for the premonition of death that saved his life, and Huaishur's rich experience in seeking death, he was afraid that this time he would have died inexplicably. Compared to the power of the hand of confinement, he was afraid that this was the golden finger that Crow had painstakingly stuffed into him. Without this skill, he was afraid that he would have died many times over. He stared at him for a long time, as if finally confirming that the person in this shell was the real him, and finally let out a sigh of relief. You can look back now. Huaishur had the courage to look back at this moment. Across the gray rainstorm and the crack that was like a natural chasm, Huaishur caught a glimpse of the original situation on the other side of the crack. Countless figures with blurry faces were suspended in the air, standing on the ground, and even the broken limbs and distorted faces poked out of the soil. When they gathered together, the dark color was like a tide, swallowing everything with the torrential rain. Across the distance, they stared straight at the two living people who had escaped from their hands. Even if it was difficult to see their faces, he could still feel the pure hunger and jealousy. In the deepest part of the crack, in the ruins of the city that sank into the mud and darkness, there was a dark and slender hand that slowly retracted. It swayed like seaweed. Huaishur looked down at his hind leg, and a pale white palm print had yet to fade. Under the erosion of the acid rain, the carapace there had actually softened like mud and flowed away, leaving only a palm-sized gap, exposing the grayish-black skin. Under the corrosion of the remaining strong acid, it brought a dull pain. What exactly is that? He asked with lingering fear. I guess that group of damn things don't even know what they are. After a long time, Huaishur withdrew his gaze from the group of dark figures bound in the torrential rain and sighed softly. Generally speaking, let's just treat those things as part of hell. The so-called hell was such a strange place. Chapter 335. After leaving the fissure, he didn't seem to be scared anymore and didn't ask any more questions. Huaishur also fell into silence. The depth here was beginning to deepen. Originally, it was just a slightly abnormal border, but now it had begun to draw closer to the abyss. The group of ghosts and the things that were poked out of the sunken city were the best proof. If Huaishur's reaction was a little slower, or without Fu Yi's help, he might have been eroded by those things and left forever in the rainstorm, or pulled closer to the sunken city. No matter how powerful an ascender was, once they made a mistake, they would usher in tragic consequences. The so-called hell was such an unreasonable place. The deeper one went, the more dangerous it was. The more unreasonable things there were, the stranger it was, or rather, the more miraculous it was. Wasn't the so-called divine mark a miracle that had transformed from hell? Even if it was the archaeological team of the Astronomical Association, there were many experienced and cautious archaeologists. It wasn't surprising or strange for them to be defeated in some strange hell ruins. And the many relics at the border were the embodiment of these disasters, strangeness, and ominous. If it wasn't for the great Zarathustra seal, the present realm wouldn't even be able to maintain a day of peace under the erosion of hell. This huge, secret ritual, which was completed by the continuous inheritance of many creators, not only wrote various laws and rules into the present realm, but also maintained an absolute power advantage in the present realm with a torrent of steel. In addition, like a city wall, it formed a barrier to resist deep erosion. Among the three major blockades of the present realm, other than the Bivras that would only be fully activated during an emergency and was usually used as a means of transportation, the one that made the greatest contribution during a stable period was the great Zarathustra conclave itself. As for the last of the three seals, it was a secret among secrets. Except for the higher-ups of the Astronomical Association, not even a word of it was spread out. However, Huaishur once heard an unexpected sneer from the crow when they were chatting. It seemed to be regarded as an example of taking credit for oneself. But she didn't elaborate. These were extremely confidential matters that she had never told Huaishur. At first, Huaisher thought that she was trying to keep him in suspense or deliberately mystifying things. Later, after he gradually came into contact with all kinds of inconceivable information shielding and operation cases of the Astronomy Society, he understood that sometimes, even if he knew this information, his name would appear on the silent monument kept by the Continuation Academy. Once he said it out loud, it would be detected by the Doomsday clock of the technical department. And if it was a few decades earlier, the whole process would be recorded by the Book of Destiny connected to the Kingdom of Heaven. It wasn't that he couldn't tell others. Just like how the Stoneforge Academy never forbade others from learning alchemy by skipping the step of buying teaching materials. Once it was known, someone would have to pay the price for the illegal circulation of this intellectual. During the period of vigilance, it was not surprising that they were even sentenced to mimetic purge. Therefore, even the dissolute crow had to keep his mouth shut most of the time. He was afraid that if he let the cat out of the bag, his contestant would be directly teleported to the Tower of London by the Bifrost and sentenced to eternal imprisonment. This time, she didn't even come in by herself. She could only help him bring in his soul ability in a roundabout way. As the biggest traitor of the Astronomy Society, Huaisher felt a lot of pressure. He even considered whether he should force Fu Yi to withdraw from this exploration. But after he said it out loud, Fu Yi naturally objected. For some reason, Huaisher always felt that her objection seemed to be very reasonable. He couldn't make the final decision. It had been a long time since he was so indecisive, which made Huaisher a little annoyed. Something's coming. The ground is shaking. Can we eat now? Wait a minute. Just as he was deep in thought, suddenly there was a messy sound around him. He stopped in his tracks, raised his head in astonishment, and looked around, but he didn't see anyone. It was just a barren forest around him. If he was a mountain ghost, he could easily rely on the vitality network here to sense the ghosts hiding in the dark. But now, other than his sense of smell and hearing, it was difficult to distinguish the enemy's location. What's wrong? Fu Yi seemed to have been awakened from a dream. She opened her eyes and carefully glanced at Huaisher. She didn't seem to have heard anything. But why did she feel a little guilty? Huaisher looked down at the stoat in the bell and said seriously, "Don't joke around." The stoat was a little nervous subconsciously, and its tail stood up. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't joke around." Huaisher emphasized again seriously and continued to walk forward. Then, the same sound came from the surroundings. Huaisher's expression turned serious, and he suddenly turned back. He didn't see anything, only the barren forest, and the strange circles of stripes on the mottled trees. For some reason, those stripes overlapped in one place, resembling strange faces. They didn't look like humans, but more like lizards or snakes. Some kind of combination of cold-blooded animals and trees. Huaisher's heart tightened. Trees can talk? Someone's coming. A face on a tree suddenly shouted. "Fu Yi, did you hear that?" Huaisher lowered his head and asked. Fu Yi was at a loss, but then another tree screamed, "The ground is shaking." An impatient face shouted, "Can we eat now?" "Wait a minute." A voice in the distance replied. Huaisher frowned. "Someone's coming. The ground is shaking. Can we eat now?" "Wait a minute." Those trees seemed to only know how to say these words. The lips on the faces opened and closed, but other than shouting, they didn't do anything. It was as if they only liked to sing and rap. But the more focused Huaisher was, the more he felt dizzy. For some reason, he felt that the markings on the trees were beginning to move. In the end, a wolf-like face appeared on the markings on a withered tree. It shouted in horror, "Trees can talk." Huaisher was stunned. On the tree, his beast face became clearer, and he shouted again, "Trees can talk." Huaisher felt dizzy, and his face became numb. He felt sleepy, as if his consciousness was divided into two, and a part of it still remained in his body. A part of it had already entered the tree. Trees could talk. The face on the withered tree widened its eyes, and its tone was 80% similar to Huaisher's. "Fu Yi, did you hear that? Trees can talk." "What the hell?" Huaisher's claws suddenly popped out and swung horizontally forward. But the tree was like an illusion. As his sharp claws swept past, it instantly dissipated. After it left, it returned to normal, but the face became more and more similar to Huai Shi's. It screamed in horror, "What the hell?" It was imitating him. No, now Huai Shi was already regretting making a sound. The more he spoke, the more this strange, withered tree resembled him. He didn't even need to think to know that if this thing became exactly like him, he wouldn't have a good time. But this appearance inexplicably reminded Huai Shi of the ceremony when he advanced a mountain ghost in the past. Tree blood urn. Wasn't the strange power of the tree blood urn extremely similar to it? It was just that it needed Huai Shi's blood, and this ghost that was still alive only needed to hear Huai Shi's voice. "Huai Shi, what's wrong with you?" Fu Yi looked blankly at Huai Shi, who seemed to have gone crazy, and was confused. "Fu Yi, did you hear that? Trees can talk." The strange withered tree's screams became more and more shrill. "Don't joke around." Just as the striped face stared fixedly at Huai Shi, the extreme version of Huai Shi's face suddenly seeped with foul-smelling blood. He snarled, imitated his tone, and constantly pulled at his consciousness and soul, until Huai Shi grinned hideously at it. "You like to imitate people, don't you?" Huai Shi looked at it indifferently and suddenly shouted, "I swear to uphold the principles of the Astronomical Association and guard the peace of the present realm. I will never let down the honor and responsibility brought by this duty. From today onwards, I uphold." The smiling face on the withered tree became more and more hideous and began to repeat what he said. But halfway through, the face suddenly stiffened, as if it was frozen, and the words came to an abrupt end. "Pah!" A tragic crack appeared on the tree's surface, causing it to let out a hiss. "You dare to imitate an oath. Do you want to die?" Huai Shi sneered and raised his claws. On his sharp claws, the cold light of the axe of wrath shone. The hand of confinement was activated, and it swept horizontally. The dual attack of matter and origin substance instantly exploded, tearing the ghostly face and the entire tree to pieces. Mournful blood spurted out from the broken tree stump. It settled. On the night of the witch, who is in charge of the Astronomical Association, shouting the oath of the Astronomical Association, a rural monster like you probably doesn't know how to die. If it was a normal person shouting, it wouldn't be a big deal, but if something with origin substance dared to shout like that under the rules of the Astronomical Association, the effect was similar to directly surrendering. If it was in the present realm, the HR department of the Central Bureau of Human Resources couldn't help but sneer after receiving the report and send a note to the processing department, sending you a black letter. In less than 3 minutes, there would be a grenade aimed at your head, letting you experience what it meant to be killed by an 8x scope with a headshot. If you can't be a member of the Astronomical Association, then be a ghost of the Astronomical Association. If it weren't for the fact that he was worried that the park would run too far away and be too far away to reach, Huai Shi would have directly shouted a few lines and let it experience the power of the good brothers in the legal department. Once it lost its strange method of dodging attacks, this guy whose mind attacks had been nullified was just a piece of cake. It wouldn't even be enough to drink 2 tails of water. Huai Shi sent them all on their way in no time at all. From beginning to end, Fu Yi blankly watched as Huai Shi turned into a destructive maniac. It wasn't until the end that she realized what was going on and suddenly realized, "Oh, were we attacked?" Huai Shi was speechless. "So you didn't notice anything at all?" Chapter 336. Until now, Huai Shi suddenly realized, it seemed maybe those guys never targeted Fu Yi at all. Since she became translucent, sometimes even Huai Shi would subconsciously ignore her, and the group of dead trees that learned to talk didn't notice Fu Yi's existence at all. Was she invisible? Or Huai Shi curiously looked at her translucent appearance and vaguely seemed to understand something. Could it be that in addition to physical concealment, she could also disappear from the perception of monsters? Especially when she was sleeping, her presence was so faint that it was impossible to notice. Just as he was deep in thought, the tip of his nose suddenly moved, and he suddenly turned around. Someone's coming. The sound of broken branches sounded, and behind the dark trees that were entangled like corpses, there was a faint sound of footsteps. The strong smell of incense spread out, but it couldn't hide the rotten smell under the robe. Carrying a heavy, rusty incense burner, the monk in a tattered robe staggered in the dense forest and slowly walked towards them. This was the first time Huaishir saw a living creature here. But it wasn't a human. It was the same as the corpses he saw on the road. It had a face that was almost like a lizard and a snake. There was no hair on its body, and under the peeled scales, there was pus and blood. It was like a deep disease. But the pair of bloodshot eyes were frighteningly bright, and when it stared at Huaishir, it was full of fanatical desire. Just as Huaishir tensed up and was about to launch an attack, the figure suddenly knelt down. Without hesitation, it bowed to him. "Holy, O great divine spirit!" It made a hoarse voice like a roar, sharp and ear-piercing. When it crawled on the ground, its body trembled in awe, and its tone was so pious that it was frightening. "Please show mercy and save this country, huh?" He froze in place with a confused face. "What are you talking about?" Ding, main quest updated. Fu Ian the bell jumped for a moment and added a sound for him. About 2 hours later, Huaishir, who was sitting on the ground, roughly understood what had happened from the prostrating monk. It was not an easy task to find out what little information was really useful among all the obscure religious expressions, praises, and epithets. He still had to try to distinguish between the real and the fake. Huaishir was mentally exhausted. After listening, he pondered for a moment and asked seriously, "In short, you mean that there are still a few countries in this world, right?" The monk nodded. "The world is facing the end of the world. Many countries have already begun to decline. If we don't do anything about it, we'll end up in the same situation as before. Is that right?" The monk nodded. "Now that you're trapped in the capital, there are only 20 to 30,000 people left in the country. Moreover, all of them are seriously ill and are about to die, right?" The monk sighed in agreement. "So, you pray devoutly, hoping that the legendary representative of God who descends every time the end of the world, the great spirit created by God, will save you?" Huaishir paused for a moment, raised his finger, and pointed at his ferocious face that did not look like a good thing. "And this great spirit is me?" The monk kowtowed in ecstasy. Huaishir thought for a moment and looked at him with pity. "Then isn't your country very pitiful?" To be honest, the country was in such a dilapidated state that they still had to rely on a large husky to save them. It was a bit too tragic. What could Huaishir do? Huaishir could give them a quick death and then burn all the things they left behind. Even if they could not go to heaven, they could at least be relieved. Other than that, Huaishir did not feel that he looked like a savior. "What are you after?" He was puzzled. 3 days ago, God has sent down an oracle. Many great spirits have come to the world. The ascetic monk struggled to speak. His Majesty has sent out all the people who can still walk to all parts of the country to search for the great spirits who have come to the world. The eternal war is about to begin. Only in this way, Holy Great Spirit, only in this way, this tortured country can be saved. The eternal war? Huaishir was silent for a moment and narrowed his eyes. "In other words, you're going to have a war?" "It is as you said." The monk kowtowed and left spots of blood on the sharp stones to show his piety. "Please give us mercy. Please, Great Spirit, destroy the impure so that the righteous can live." "What should we do?" Huaishir asked Fu Yi, who was hiding in the bell. Through telepathy, "I have a feeling that they are just tools." "Ah, no, tool dogs." "Don't worry, he is not lying." Fu Yi seemed to be unexpectedly certain in this regard. "They are sincere in looking for you, and they have no intention of harming you." Just now, there was a new authority discussion group in the internal communication forum of the Astronomy Society called the Eternal War, but I don't have the authority to activate it, so I can't open it. Amazing. How can you authority dogs have such a thing? Isn't it strange for someone like you, who has nothing? However, there isn't anything of real value on it. Although the atmosphere is very harmonious, everyone is a competitor. That kind of hard work and experience of pioneering will definitely not be posted. Occasionally, there will be some reminders and guidelines to prevent those who are lagging behind from being killed at first sight. Fu Yi flipped through the few posts in the forum, as if she could see the look of those people who were afraid of leaking any key information, and sighed helplessly. They should have reported the really useful things, right? I can also see a lot of tasks posted by outside scholars, most of which are physical exploration and professional experiments to get specific data and parameters. Anyway, I don't understand any of them, and it is not my place to care. After hearing this, Huaisher looked up to the sky and sighed, feeling more and more helpless. The scholars of the Continuation Academy were all treasures. Only the low-level thugs like him were like grass, lacking the motherly love from the higher-ups, and even the configuration was the simplified version, killing but not burying. It is so important to study hard. He sighed from the bottom of his heart. Yeah. The monk kneeling on the ground looked confused, not knowing what Deling was talking about. Okay, let's go. Huaisher spat and dragged the iron stake behind him with his tail again. Lead the way, and we will go to, where is your place? The capital. The monk was overjoyed. Yes, the capital. Huaisher shook his head. I want to see what kind of trouble you can stir up. The ecstatic monk got up from the ground and screamed in surprise, rolling and crawling in front, looking back from time to time to see if Huaisher was following behind. He was afraid that he would suddenly disappear. Huaisher followed behind. As the monk shook the incense burner in his hand, a strong smell of copper rose into the air. Under the lingering fragrance, everything in front of him seemed to tremble slightly. In just a few steps, he walked out of the dense forest. His speed was unbelievably fast. With a burning incense burner in hand, the monk led the way in front, reminding Huaisher not to walk out of the range of the incense. This kind of experience was too strange. Under the envelopment of the fragrance, they clearly didn't take many steps forward, but when they came back to their senses, they felt that they had walked a long way from their original position. With a few steps, he crossed a mountain ridge and a large river. Furthermore, he didn't encounter anything strange after that. It was as smooth and safe as sightseeing. What's that? Huaisher asked curiously. Holy oil, the kingdom's final collection, a precious treasure left behind from the previous era, the monk explained in a hoarse voice. As long as we are within the range of the incense, we can temporarily suppress the mutation so that those strange and ominous things won't be able to detect us. Those ominous things you mentioned, are there many of them? Except for the king's city, which still has a little light from the burning of the holy oil, all the other places have been occupied by plague and death. The monk gasped hoarsely, as if he was crying bitterly, but his voice sounded like he was laughing wildly, sending chills down people's spines. Those who do not believe, those who have been abandoned by the gods, have been cursed. Only the beloved believers can live forever, forever. All right, whatever you say. Huaisher curled his lips and heard Fu Yi's reminder. Look at the sky. A shadow quickly swept across the ground. It was a huge projection from the sky. As Huaisher looked up, he saw a huge bird flying out from behind the broken clouds. It was like a huge bomber passing through the sky. When it flapped its wings, it set off a burst of low thunder. From the sky, it cast an indifferent glance at the wolf beast and the group on the ground. In its claws, it was holding a monk-like person, waving at the group on the ground. Great spirit! Another great spirit! The monk next to Huaisher shouted in surprise, almost crying with joy. God, the sixth great spirit has also come to our country. God bless the kingdom! God bless the kingdom! God is looking after us, merciful and gracious. Mercy and grace. Huaisher rolled his eyes. He almost couldn't stand this guy's fanatical belief. He asked Fu, is that someone from the Astronomical Association? It should be another explorer. I don't see the Astronomical Association's logo. Fu, he replied, but I'm scanning more and more explorer signals. Everyone seems to be gathering in this area. All right, I smell the scent of PvP. Huaisher sighed, but for some reason, he was a little excited. Was it an eternal battle between monsters? People couldn't help but look forward to it. They continued to move forward, passing by barren mountains, plains filled with black tentacles and tumors, lakes and rivers filled with strange eyeballs, forests and grasslands that were as colorful as flesh and blood, as well as ruins, 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 Corpses, corpses, and corpses. There were more and more cracks in the ground, even forming a bottomless valley that extended to the end of Huaishi's line of sight. And they walked along the deep valley. Finally, in the aura of death and decay, they finally found a slightly more complete building and road, as well as a glimpse of the towering city walls and countless layers of dense cold buildings. It was like a war fortress built on the mountain. Every corner revealed sharpness and ferocity, without any of the noise and life of an ordinary city. Instead, it exuded a ferocious feeling like a beast. The capital. They finally arrived at the country of fog. Wait a moment, I have a question. Huaishi raised his finger and pointed to the mountain in the distance. The one in front is your capital, right? The monk nodded. Then Huaishi asked curiously, across the valley below the mountain, which 5 cities belong to? Chapter 337. Under the dim yellow sky with a trace of blood, the earth was full of devastation. Huge cracks that seemed to lead to the abyss crisscrossed the ground. Compared to them, even a huge Huaishi was just an insignificant speck of dust. As the cracks and valleys crisscrossed, a huge mountain had been completely divided. It was like a cake that kindergarten children had drunk too much vodka and were dividing. It was simply a mess and did not conform to the common sense of geography at all. On the broken mountain in front of Huaishi was the capital city that the lizard monk spoke of. But the problem was, in addition to the heavily guarded capital city, the other mountains were clearly built in a style completely different from their capital city, but at the same time, filled with a gloomy and cold aura. It was as if they were confronting each other. Huaishi could even see the brown bloodstains on the layers of the walls after the layers of dry blood were splashed on them. From a distance, a rotten smell came from the deep valley. Who knew how many rotting corpses could emit such a strong stench, which made Huaishi feel more and more uncomfortable. That is also the capital city. The monk's snake eyes showed indescribable hatred. The capital city of the faithless, the nest of the heretics, the gathering place of the devils on the earth. One day, those sinners will be destroyed in the thunder of God's punishment. Your God is quite creative. Huaishi climbed to a mound and looked up into the distance. He was almost amused. Those few capital cities were completely built on the edge of the crack of the abyss. They relied on the geographical advantage to build fortresses and then faced each other with heavy security. Now it seemed that those cracks were a sign of the division of territory between countries, right? But where did so many little geniuses move the capital city to the border of the country and transform it into military fortresses come from? Even the emperor did not guard the country's gate like this, did he? It was as if he could not wait to go on a personal expedition every morning before he got up to go to the toilet. What was he after? He was simply crazy. It seemed that it had been many years since they were built. Now, one of the 6 cities had completely declined, collapsed, and turned into ruins, while the other 5 cities still maintained their hostility toward each other and were at daggers drawn. Standing dozens of kilometers away, Huaishi could already smell all kinds of smells from there. The smell of wild beasts. Who knew how many explorers were now in those cities, waiting for the eternal war to begin? How many of them are GM cheats? Huaishi asked. There are about 5 people who have shown themselves. He glanced at the map. 1 on this side, 3 on the left, and 1 on the opposite side. It's good to have authority. Huaishi took a sip of lemon and glanced at the fanatical monk. Let's go. Lead the way. Didn't you say that the king wants to see me? Please follow me. The monk carried the incense burner of the incense of the mountain. The whole capital was filled with a strange smell. Standing in front of the long and narrow city gate and looking up at the towering city wall, one would feel an incomprehensible confusion from the almost absurd Gothic style. Why is the great lizard kingdom still alive when it's in such a mess? Under the cold high walls and sharp spires, gloomy and sharp shadows were cast, covering a numb face. Every pair of eyes that could still be open were covered with blood vessels. When they stared at Huaishi, they were so fanatical and happy that it made people uncomfortable. When Huaishi walked into the city, No one was afraid that the evil beasts on the road would devour them. Instead, they could not wait to crawl on the ground and beg for the grace of the Great Spirit. There were coughing sounds, moaning sounds, and screams in the distance. There was also a rancid smell. There were so few pedestrians that it almost became an empty city, but the strange sounds coming from behind the wall were 100 times more than the pedestrians on the street today. It was as if more dying people were unwillingly letting out their own voices. Fear, uneasiness, pain, and despair. Incomprehensible fanaticism. Prayer. Those clear, vague, hoarse, or high-pitched voices gathered in one place, reciting the scriptures given by God in unison in the cold and gloomy sound of the bell. As she walked up the steep steps, Huaishur felt that the rancid smell was getting thicker and thicker. This feeling was very strange, as if he was walking step by step into the rotting corpse of a giant beast. The smell of decay was everywhere. "It's too disgusting." Fu, he whispered, "Is the border and hell like this?" "Bullshit. There is an amusement park in hell. It's really fun, you know?" Everyone who went to the ghost castle and went to the amusement park gave us a thumbs up. Huaishur felt that at this time, as the prince of the amusement park, he had to stand up for his work unit. But Fu Yi did not believe him at all. He was about to say something when he heard a roar. It was the loud noise of the palace gate opening. The heavy rocks rubbed against each other, and the solemn faces on the countless reliefs seemed to roar and sing a hymn in unison. The incense was so strong that Huaishur's sense of smell felt uncomfortable as it rushed towards them and drowned them. But Fu Yi said that she did not smell anything and was not affected at all. She just reminded him that the map showed that there was a huge red reaction in front that the Astronomical Association's system panel could not analyze, and asked him to be careful. As the palace gates opened one by one, Huaishur went straight in. He did not even see many guards at all, only a few hunched figures covered in armor standing in the corner. The sound of breathing and coughing was so faint. In the next moment, everyone fell to the ground, and Huaishur would not be surprised. In the end, Huaishur finally saw His Majesty the King in the former magnificent and solemn hall, but everything was different from what he had imagined. The former magnificence was now dim and decadent, and the solemn and cold atmosphere had become uncomfortable and oppressive. In the hoarse hymn of the monks, Huaishur smelled the rancid smell behind the curtain. It was a ruined smell that could not be concealed no matter how solemn the hymns and fragrant the incense. The front of the high throne was covered with gray gauze and silk, and the dust on it made people wonder if the curtains had been washed in the time since the palace was decorated. What was more noteworthy was the hunched and thin figure on the throne, and the faint and hoarse moans that were like whispers. It was as if they were talking, but the voice could not be heard clearly. Only the old priests kneeling under the throne respectfully kowtowed and listened. After a long time, the old chief priest raised his turbid eyes and looked at Huaishur, who could be called a giant, at the bottom of the steps. His Majesty expresses his heartfelt gratitude and appreciation for your arrival, and his admiration for your character of abhorrence of evil and your righteous indignation against the unclean. Huaishur was stunned. "Are you all translators? But don't fool me. The king just coughed a few times and took a few breaths. Why did you translate such a long paragraph?" He raised his eyelids in surprise, afraid that the old man would suddenly tell him after a while, "Sorry, I don't understand what the king said. I just translated it blindly." Behind the curtain, the moans on the throne sounded again, and the chief priest grinned and raised his hands with honor. "His Majesty is pleased. His Majesty is pleased." At the bottom of the steps, the prostrating priests shouted excitedly. "Well, if you want to be happy, you have to make such a big scene. Are you afraid that people don't know you are happy? The eternal war is about to start. The Great Spirit with the will of God. Please rest in the temple with the other great spirits for a while." The chief priest continued to translate. "It is your destiny to show your skills in the war to defend the right and the will of God. As for everything else, you don't have to worry. We will offer you all the food and water. We only hope that you can recharge your energy and put an end to the eternal war to prove the will of God." After saying that, he paused for a moment, as if he was listening to the moans behind the curtain. Then he said in a solemn voice, "At that time, the strongest great spirit will be on the altar and merge with the honorable holy body of the deities." Following his fanatical shouts, the heavy silk curtain finally opened slowly to the sides under the pull of the servants' long hooks. And Huaisher finally saw the holy object enshrined with fragrant incense on the towering altar behind the throne. It represented the proof that the gods had once existed. A withered and decayed broken eye. It was only the size of a fist. It was full of cracks. Like a broken glass marble, the scarlet color almost overflowed from the scars and turned into a thin line, winding down the altar. That was the source of the huge, unknown red reaction. Just by looking at it, he felt a piercing pain in his eyes. Huaisher's scales were rubbing against each other in pain. The ancient gaze was squeezing out his consciousness and soul, forcing him to kneel before the noble, saintly body. But what he cared about more was the stooped and old king on the throne in front of the altar. Why wasn't he dead yet? No matter who saw the king for the first time, they should have thought so. Decayed to such a state, he should have started to rot, right? But on a shriveled and stooped body, the eye that was covered with haze still stubbornly opened. Even if the eye was dim and without light, it was just like a mummy. However, from the saint body on the altar, a thin and sticky thread of blood slowly swam to his body, sustaining his life with the power of the saint body. His senseless agony seemed to last for eternity. The unsightly distortion had been entangled in every part of the body, but he was still breathing, moaning, and experiencing the pain of survival. The mutated bones pierced out of his skull, decorated with jewel-like mold, forming a deformed crown on his head. Under the old and colorless silk clothes, the heart was still beating stubbornly on the shriveled skeleton-like chest. With the difficult rhythm of the pulse, the blood vessels that grew out of his body sank into the throne behind him, passing through the rocks. They had already spread to the deepest part of the city like the roots of a tree, enveloping the entire cold and gloomy capital. It connected him to the city. The weak breathing was like a spider's silk, pulling the power of thousands of pounds, firmly maintaining the last lifeline of the country. Huaisher finally understood why the city could still survive so many disasters. "I'm counting on you, Great Spirit." On the throne, the dying but not dead king struggled to raise an ugly smile and finally let out a hoarse voice in the midst of moaning. "Please give this country, the final salvation and relief." Chapter 338. There seemed to be no distinction between night and day in the king's city. It was always like dusk, neither bright nor dark, which made people unhappy. It was neither dry nor brittle. It was just like this world and this country and other countries. Slowly and sticky, they were immersed in death little by little, but there was still a long way to go before the final happy end. It was as if they were lying in the intensive care unit with tubes inserted. Death wasn't torture. It was the endless pain before death. I think it's all very pitiful. In a huge temple that seemed to be specially built for giant beasts, Huaisher heard Fu Yi's sigh. Huaisher glanced back and couldn't help but remind her, if you can spit out the pine cone in your mouth when you speak, your feelings will be more sincere. But what does this have to do with me? Fu Yi tilted her head and calmly asked, "Anyway, I'm not the one who's going to make the puppets. If I'm really hot-blooded, won't you be in front of me?" "Wow, you really don't have any love at all." Fu Yi rolled her eyes. "I've become a stoat. Why would a husky say that I don't have any love?" Hearing her tired voice, Huaisher shook his head. "Are you scared?" Even Huaisher, who was experienced and knowledgeable, was a little scared by the scene, let alone Fu Yi. "If you want to say that I'm scared, it's a little bit, but more than that. I'm probably disgusted." Fu Yi thought for a moment and said seriously, "It's really ugly that you're not willing to just die when you're at death's door." It was hard to say how disgusting it was. Glancing at her expression that not only was she not afraid, but was also full of shame, hurry up and leave the group. Huaisher began to wonder if this woman's nerves were a little too tenacious. "I say, aren't you scared? What's there to be scared of?" Fu Yi asked. "I have the GM authority and a golden fighter bodyguard. What's there to be scared of? You don't want me to leave the group again, do you? I won't. The translucent stoat shrank back into the bell again, as if it didn't want to listen to the huskies chanting, which made Huaisher feel very helpless. Forget it. It's up to you whether you want to withdraw or not. Huaisher shook his head and heard a knock on the door of the temple. Holy Spirit, the medal you requested has been delivered. Huaisher stretched out his hand and pulled the bell to a place where no one could see it. He coughed twice and let the group of lizard men who serve him enter. However, looking at their dying appearance, Huaisher was really afraid that these guys would suddenly die when they pushed the cart in. The two carriages were filled with all kinds of metal products that Huaisher had requested. Now, there was more than a small mountain of gold, silver, bronze, and black iron, emitting a sweet and delicious rusty smell and a spicy metallic smell. A good dinner, plus rare metal materials. After they left and closed the door, Huaisher casually pulled out half of it to make tonight's supper, and then took out the snake spine that he had dragged with his tail for tens of thousands of miles. Now, the flat snake spine had been covered with several layers of Huaisher's molten iron saliva, and it emitted an indescribable saliva smell that made Fu Yi's nose feel very uncomfortable. What are you doing? She poked her head out and asked. Isn't the PvP starting tomorrow? Huaisher pressed his feet on the iron stake and grinned, revealing a row of sharp teeth. I'm going to prepare a surprise for the other side. Soon, the high-pitched sound of metal rubbing together rang out from the temple. It rumbled throughout the night. At first, Fu Yi was annoyed, but later on, as she listened, she gradually fell asleep to the rhythmic music. When dawn was about to break, she was awakened by the screams coming from the city. She suddenly raised her eyes and looked at Huaisher in shock. What's going on? Huaisher, who had made a dog-power grinding wheel out of nowhere, turned around in shock, his ears twitching in confusion, and said in a loud voice, What did you say? All right. After fiddling around for an entire night, he didn't want to make himself deaf before he could even do anything. Fu Yi frowned. Listen carefully. In the silence, Huaisher tried hard to listen, and finally heard the gradually fading screams, as if there was no strength left, leaving only weak echoes. The direction seemed to be the palace. For a moment, both of them looked serious. Do you want to go out and take a look? Huaisher held the bell in his mouth and waited, fearing that there would be traitors in the city who would kill the king in the night, and then lead the army to clean up the king's side. Well, clean up this group of monsters that the king had invited. Before the door was pushed open, he heard a low knock on the door. A low voice that he had never heard before sounded. May I ask if May is here? It was a different voice from the lizard men in the city. It was polite and came from the outside world, with a rather elegant retroflex sound and an authentic accent. Huaisher and Fu Yi looked at each other, confused. Is your mother an acquaintance? Huaisher asked in a low voice. I don't know. Fu Yi shook her head. I don't remember. Never heard of it. Then it seems that Mr. Niflheim was right. May's daughter was involved in an accident. The low voice said, Hello, Mr. Huai behind the door. I am a member of the internal exploration team of the Witch's Night, named Jonathan. This time, I was ordered to come here to ensure the safety of Miss Fu Yi. If you're worried, you can let Miss Fu Yi confirm my identity through the plugin. A pop-up window suddenly popped up in front of Fu Yi, showing the information of Jonathan Hall. Gravitational Balance Group of the Astronomy Society Continuation Institute, double scholar of geomagnetism and geology, senior alchemist and member of the archaeology team. A-level authority. Registration name. I see. After Fu Yi nodded, Huaisher opened the door and saw the black snake coiled up on the stone steps in front of the door. It was like a statue, its whole body shining with the luster of crystals. Its eyes were like amber. Huaisher's eyes narrowed slightly. According to their speculation, generally, the type of animal one turned into should be determined by personality and usual habits at the beginning. And things like snakes did not look like good people. Don't get me wrong, although I look like a long strip, in fact. I am a lizard type. Jonathan seemed to have guessed what he was thinking and awkwardly raised the two rather small and delicate legs under his body. I chose the crystal lizard in hell when I transformed. Strictly speaking, I am still May's fellow disciple. No matter what, I will not harm people in front of a military officer with an internal rating of S level. Huaishur had heard of the crystal lizard before, and he had also seen it in the illustrated handbook. It was a variant of the petrifying lizard, a gem-type mutant. After ignoring the overly large body, it was not far from what he was referring to, but an internal rating of S level? Huaishur himself was shocked. Why was the rating so high? If it's possible, can you let me in first? Jonathan poked his head out and looked at the stoat hiding behind the metal pile inside. He tried to squeeze out a kind smile, but the result was that he looked exceptionally ferocious. Fu Yi quickly shrank her head and did not come out. Please come in. Huaishur made way for the unknown, and after he went in, he closed the door. The screams outside should be from a few explorers who overestimated themselves and wanted to take advantage of the kingdom's decline to seize the sacred remains. Now they have reaped what they have sown. Jonathan seemed to know what they were most concerned about, and took the lead to say, "These 2 days, I have mainly been studying that thing. It is not something we can come into contact with at the moment. Without more than 6 transformations, let alone devouring it, we will be swallowed by the remnant will of that thing. Unfortunately, I have tried to persuade them, but no one listened." With his words, the screams finally faded away. What replaced them was a dead silence. Silence once again enveloped the entire King City. Hearing this, Huaishur could not help but gasp. As expected of the Astronomical Association, why were there so many stubborn people? Huaishur had goosebumps when he saw the broken thing on the altar. There were actually people who dared to have designs on that thing. He and Fu Yi had already speculated, and combined with what they had seen in the murals in the cave, the god that these lizard men worshipped was probably a terrifying giant beast that was comparable to the mountains in the past. The remains left behind by the giant beast, even if it was an upgrade tool, was not something that a group of newbies like them who had just arrived in Stormwind City could touch. I came this time mainly because I was entrusted by the 2 creators, Mr. Niffenheim and Mr. Shack, to find Miss Fu Yi and apologize for our mistakes, as well as provide help and compensation. Jonathan said slowly. If Miss Fu Yi is willing to leave, you just have to wait for a while, and a special passage will be prepared outside. With my help, there won't be any problems. Fu Yi did not speak, as if she did not understand. She rolled her eyes and focused on the dust on the roof. Jonathan seemed to be about to say something, but his mouth suddenly paused, and there was a crackling sound in the air. Fu Yi's hair trembled, and he was stunned for a long time. Soon, he seemed to understand something, and looked at Fu Yi with a faint smile. It seems that Miss Fu's progress is much faster than I thought. Well, with Mr. Huaishur's assistance, there won't be any danger. Huaishur was stunned. What happened? Also, brother, isn't your trust in me a little too much? What the hell is that S-level evaluation? He coughed dryly and asked. Ah, that's the evaluation of the potential of the internal members. Jonathan turned around and explained, in the document that Mr. Niffenheim sent me, Mr. Huaishur was classified as a trusted file that can be used to seek help and entrust when necessary. His ranking is quite high. Oh, to be honest, to have such a terrifying record at the age of 17 is really scary, especially with his upright character and admirable style. It's too rare. Although there are some flaws in his relationship, they can't be hidden. Wait. Huaishur's eyes widened, and he tried to suppress his anger as he explained, "Don't talk nonsense. I don't have any flaws in my relationship. How dare you defame me in front of my good brother? Prince can tolerate it, but not paradise. Do you know the punishment for image damage? Ahem, sorry, after all, it's personal privacy." Jonathan seemed embarrassed. Blacksnake smiled at Huaishur. "Please don't mind it. Beep. Favorability -100. Huaishur dubbed it in his mind, and the words were marked in blood red. He walked to the door in a bad mood. "Okay, since Fu Yi doesn't want to leave, I'll take care of her. There's no tea here, Mr. Jonathan. You can leave." Ahem. Wait a minute. Jonathan was a little panicked and quickly said, In fact, I came here this time not only to kick Miss Fui out, but also to form an alliance. Chapter 339. Thanks to the leader of Shaoshan. Alliance? Huaishur pretended to be puzzled and tilted its head. Huh, aren't we allies? Jonathan snorted. Then you can only be called passers-by on the same side, right? When others are in trouble, will you really help them? Of course. Huaishur blinked her big, innocent eyes at him, as if she was talking about something that was perfectly justified. Bragging was free anyway, so he could brag for now. It was a seller's market now. After learning from Crow for so long, he didn't have any attainment in being black-hearted, but when it came to being thick-skinned, he really didn't think much of others. He wasn't in a hurry. Anyway, Jonathan was the one who was in a hurry. He actually didn't mind teaming up with others. After all, Jonathan's background was guaranteed. But if he didn't accept anything, then wouldn't Jonathan have come for nothing? In short, if he didn't get something solid out of him today, Huaishur wouldn't agree. Jonathan didn't say anything, and his face was full of astonishment. It was unknown if he was shocked by Huaishur's shamelessness or if he sincerely admired such noble morals. After a long time, he sighed. Teacher Sheha was right when he said that you don't wake up early if there are no benefits. Oh, we're all members of the astronomy club. There's no such thing as money or benefits. We rely on our parents at home and rely on our brothers when we go out. How can I not be willing when you come to me for help? After making a mental note of a certain grandson named Sheikh in his heart, Huaishur squeezed out an awkward smile and threw out another question. But there should be a lot of explorers from the astronomy club in the city, right? He asked. Why are you looking for us? Jonathan's expression suddenly became conflicted. Ahem, that's a bit of a long story. Huaishur nodded her head. Then why don't we stop here for today? As for the rest, we can talk tomorrow. Jonathan's expression became more and more bitter. Little brother, why aren't you following the routine? Huaishur blinked his big watery eyes as if he didn't know anything. Only his tail was wagging proudly, waiting for him to answer. He didn't want anything. He just wanted to be mischievous. For the past 2 days, his good brother had been by his side, so he couldn't say anything flirtatious. It was quite uncomfortable to hold it in. Jonathan sighed and explained the reason in detail. In fact, everyone had their own social circle. Even if it was a peaceful two-dimensional world, they would still fight over a single character, let alone the academic world. As a double scholar of geology and geomagnetism, Jonathan's ability was not low. Although the power of a scholar was useless here, his combat power after the transformation was still quite impressive. It could be said that she was a rare talent. But the problem was there would always be some people who would latch onto the tail of positivism and go around shouting that geology wasn't science. When encountering such an idiot, Jonathan would usually beat the dog's brains out. After 2 or 3 times, he was satisfied, but it caused his reputation to be tarnished. Well, if this was a public institution, he would definitely be the one with the worst relationships in the department. Every winter, his share would definitely be the narrowest. Moreover, most of the people who came in this time were scholars of biology and meteorology. There were not many geologists, so he couldn't even hug them. On the other hand, it was because the experimental project he spent a lot of effort on in the underground world had failed. Sometimes, academia was so cruel. A law often required decades to be deduced, analyzed, and established before it could be applied and practiced. But to deny it, it only took a moment. An unexpected small bug completely destroyed his geological model, making all his previous efforts go down the drain. He didn't want to join other people's research teams and had no time to find another research direction. There was no way out. Just when he was feeling terrible, he was recommended by his former teacher, Shaq, to accept the mission of another creator, Niflheim, to go to the country of fog to find Fui. When he was studying in America, he even had to attend the parent-teacher conference for his boss. Moreover, his sister-in-law was so beautiful, so he wouldn't lose out. He might as well use his remaining energy. However, Huaishur's appearance rekindled a glimmer of hope in him. He decided to lie low for a while and change his research direction. You want to study the remains of God. Huaishur widened his eyes in disbelief. So many people just died. Why are you still thinking about Hell's Gate? Ahem, I don't want to steal it. In fact, I just want to get more research data. Speaking of which, before I specialized in geology because of my hobby, Madame May and I were both teacher shack students. I more or less remember the laws of the origin of life and historical evolution. Jonathan rubbed his hands awkwardly. That's why I'm planning to see if I can get more data and laws from such a good topic, write a paper, and get my certificate in paleontology later. If he could succeed, he would be a scholar in 3 fields. If he mastered the 3 major subjects of geomagnetism, geology, and paleontology, wouldn't it be easier to make progress in the future? However, after he said his plan, what greeted him was not the admiration and astonishment he had expected. Instead, he was met with 2 cold gazes. Huaishir and Fu Yi exchanged a look. I think it's better to forget about it, Fu Yi said. I think so too. Huaishir nodded. None of the top students are innocent. Sensing the malice of the self-study scum, Jonathan suddenly panicked. Wait, I'm also very useful. Hey, I'm actually very strong. As Jonathan spoke, he waved his claws. The iron materials that Huaishir had piled up in the corner were suddenly shrouded by an invisible magnetic force. They abruptly shrank into a ball and suspended in the air. Look, I definitely won't hold you back. If I use my full strength, I can control the geomagnetic repulsion to reach 1,000 tons. Wow, all things heavenly attraction. Huaishir, who was eating melon seeds, applauded. Awesome, awesome, awesome. For a moment, Huaishir could not stop praising him. It seemed that there was no end to the compliments, but he had no intention of nodding or relenting at all. He just looked at Jonathan with his big eyes, waiting for him to finish. Well, there's indeed a little flaw. Jonathan sighed helplessly. When I control the magnetic force, there is not much resistance at all. Moreover, if the overclocking time is too long, it will cause shock due to insufficient blood supply. When he said this, Huaishir finally understood. Well, you're looking for a tank. I don't care about the spoils of war and the exploration of the Witch's Night. If there's anything, it can all be yours. I just want to find a bodyguard to stay for a while and collect more data that will be used in the thesis. If it doesn't involve life-threatening situations, I will unconditionally assist you. You just need to leave one alive to give me the finishing blow every now and then and accumulate the power of evolution. Jonathan sighed. In the end, he didn't want to waste time on a negotiation that was meaningless to him. This is my final offer, Mr. Hui. If you agree, I have additional information here for you. If you don't agree, please tell me as soon as possible. I can also talk to someone else. I agree. Why don't you agree? Seeing that he was about to get all the benefits, Huaishir immediately clapped his paws and said enthusiastically, Look at me. Isn't my reaction slow? Brother Qiao, don't worry. It's Jonathan. The rock lizard corrected him helplessly. It's all the same. It's all the same. Huaishir enthusiastically reached out his paw and shook its paw. Regarding the conditions proposed by the scholar, he helplessly expressed that they were all family. Why do they have to be so distant? Since it was no different from bringing 1 or 2, he might as well bring them all together. So, the information you mentioned, Huaishir licked his nose. Is it powerful? I don't know if it's powerful or not, but it can be considered special for the time being. Jonathan let out a long breath. It was obvious that a huge stone had been lifted from his heart. It was not easy to find a bodyguard these days. Those who could fight were unreliable and easy to backstab, and those who were honest and sincere often could not guard against open knives and hidden arrows. A bodyguard like Huaishir who could fight exceptionally well and whose integrity was guaranteed, but who was just listless and bad, was really hard to find. He was also afraid that Huaishir would not agree. As for the information, he was confident that it was exclusive to him. This country is maintained by the blood of the giant beast, he said. To be exact, all the remaining countries are like this. What? Huaishir was stunned. This is the true face of the eternal war, Jonathan said. A war to screen the gods and survivors before the arrival of the end of the world. As a mutated branch of the petrifying lizards, crystal lizards often had different special organs and abilities according to their own crystals. It was the direction that Jonathan chose when he transformed into a magnetic crystal lizard, which was the closest to his specialty. But it seemed that there was a little problem in the transformation process, which caused his 4 legs to become ornaments and his mobility to be greatly reduced. At the cost of this, his own talent was greatly enhanced. Now, not only could he smell the faint changes in geomagnetism, but he could even read the broken records from the chaotic magnetic fields in places with many magnetic mines. Among them were the experiment records preserved from the last era, Jonathan said solemnly. Before the Night of the Witch, this experiment had been carried out many times in the abyss, and the relevant laws and theorems had been developed quite thoroughly. However, the earliest explorers were not us, but the various abyssals who did not enter. Now, many genes and bloodlines have been passed down here, which is why we can see so many types of creatures here. But there is no doubt that the end of the world has come many times. That is to say, the eras are divided by the end of the world? Huaisher asked. Jonathan nodded. And there's been a quite mature way to deal with the end of the world, which is the so-called eternal war. The gods they worship were once the best among the giant beasts. You should know this by looking at the sacred remains on the altar, right? Jonathan's lizard face showed a sneer. Do you know where the sacred oil that the monks burned came from? It is the blood of the giant beasts that have transformed more than 7 times. This country survived until now by burning the blood of the giant beasts that were once buried underground, just like all the other countries. Not only this continental area, but other continental areas and even the ocean are probably the same. Similar eternal war? I am afraid that it has been carried out all over the territory. What the hell? Huaisher, who thought that this place was already the whole map, was stunned. Are we still leveling up by changing one map after another? Chapter 340. According to the Astronomical Society's method of measurement, the scholars had figured out the size of the witch's dream. It had to be said that among the many creators, this unknown creator who had passed away was also at the forefront. He was able to create such a huge, illusory world just by relying on the laws and knowledge he had mastered. Purely in terms of spatial scale, it was almost not inferior to any continent. And the area where the 6 countries were located was just a corner of it. Other than that, there was an even bigger world. Come on, it's convenient to fight Frisia after Piccolo. Huaisher raised his claw to signal him to stop talking and went straight to the point. What you mean just now is that the blood of the behemoth can prevent the depth from deepening. I'm afraid it's a rule that only belongs here, a rule that was set up to force the explorers to evolve faster, Jonathan explained. Including the Battle of Eternity, it is also a ritual born to speed up the evolution process. Isn't this like raising poisonous insects? Huaisher pinched his chin. I feel like I've seen this style somewhere before. You're not hiding anything from me, are you? No. Jonathan shook his lizard head like a rattle drum. We're all allies. How can I lie to you? It was not easy to find an ally. What if he was scared away? Not to mention the abyssal food chain. Even the words rancher and destructive factor would not come out of his mouth. When scholars were bad, they were really bad. For the sake of research, they would even give up their lives, so why would they want anything else? There was an old joke in the Astronomical Society. It was said that 3 old scholars were walking in hell when they were suddenly caught by a destructive factor that they had never seen before. The first reaction of the 3 was not to run away, but to start racking their brains to think of how to stop the other 2 from snatching the thesis topic from them. At the same time, they were also on guard against the other 2 from killing them for the thesis. Seeing that Huaisher had sensed something was wrong, he quickly changed the topic. I've been around the capital for the past 2 days. I've even taken the risk to go to other countries and checked almost all the mineral veins that I could come into contact with. This is what I inferred based on the fragmentary records stored in the magnetic field. It may not be correct, but it's definitely not far from the truth. Jonathan coughed a few times solemnly and threw out the most important information. The so-called eternal war is to let the giant beasts kill each other. Through killing, They will evolve continuously and compete for the strongest. Then, they will merge with the divine remains and transform into new gods. They will protect their race so that they can survive the destruction brought by the apocalypse and usher in a new era. What if all the giant beasts in your house are slaughtered? Then it's over. Jonathan pointed at the ruins on the other lonely mountain expressionlessly. That was the result of failure in the battle of eternity. In order to survive the apocalypse, every country will do whatever it takes to kill the great spirits of other countries. Starting from noon today, the Rift Valley will become the bloodiest battlefield. When that time comes, not only the great beasts, but the other countries will also spare no effort to support their great spirits. However, I feel that the lizardmen won't be able to do anything other than provide us with food and water. After all, the country of fog is the weakest among all the countries. In the silence, Huaisher looked at him and suddenly asked, "Before the battle of eternity begins, is it too late for us to be a traitor?" "Don't worry, listen to me." Jonathan was used to keeping people in suspense, but he did not expect Huaisher to be so adept at being a traitor. She did not have any integrity at all. He was a little anxious. Although the country of fog is the weakest, it has the most resources. After all, among all the existing countries, they're the only country that can survive from 3 eras to the present. They have experienced at least 3 eternal wars. The divine remains that have experienced 3 generations of inheritance are definitely the best among all the countries. Don't you want to fight? Not all. I have already said that the great lizard country will be done for. Fu, you pack up, let's go. Just when Huaisher was about to pack up and take Monkey King back to Gao Lao village, he suddenly felt a mighty bell ring in the deepest part of King City. In the roar that was like the roar of a giant beast, in an instant, a layer of vague and ferocious aura descended from the sky and entered the temples all over the city. In an instant, it persisted on Huaisher and the others. It was as if the gods above the sky cast an indifferent glance down and gave a meager gift. In an instant, the progress of Huaisher's bone's metallization actually jumped a lot. After the bone marrow experienced a burst of stinging pain, it actually glowed with a faint golden light, making the blood in the body become like viscous iron slurry, flowing with a cold silver light. Feeling the numbness and itchiness in his body and the increase of more than 20% of his muscle strength, Huaisher couldn't help but click his tongue. Well, the money is given out pretty quickly. Jonathan, who looked more and more gray, comforted him. "If you think so, you are already here. Moreover, your camp has been bound the moment you enter the city. Otherwise, why would I be chased away like a grandson when I went to other countries for a stroll these 2 days?" Huaisher thought for a moment and asked seriously, "Because I am weak?" They had already died dozens of times today. Jonathan rolled his eyes and didn't want to talk to him anymore. The prelude to the eternal war was finally pulled apart amidst the continuous roars and roars of the giant beasts. When the mighty bell ring dissipated, the whole silent king city seemed to be boiling suddenly. Countless hoarse and fanatical voices shouted and devoutly chanted sacred hymns. In the shroud of the song, the whole city seemed to have returned to the holiness of the past. The old and decaying spots and ulcers on the faces faded away. The final radiance of the setting sun. Countless aberrated lizard men in iron armor bathed in the holy water sprinkled by the priests and monks. They greedily sniffed the rich incense, causing their bodies to swell more and more. Their eyes were blood red, and the desire to kill and eat began to expand wildly. They chanted the hymns hoarsely and couldn't wait any longer. Just in the middle of the formation, the priests on horseback held up banners and bone prayer beads, and loudly preached to the soldiers who were on the verge of losing control. "Let us enter a sacred war, a great war to regain the glory of the kingdom and the gods. Let all the pain and torture stop, and embark on the journey to the eternal war. Win back the glory from the hands of those evil, unclean people and demon beasts. Let the subjects of the aberration prove their faith in the truth. Let those ignorant people who have lived mediocre lives for money discover true justice and truth. Let everything in this world be bathed in the divine gift. The old priest shouted with all his might, "For the great gods!" So, the sharp voice of the mountain rushed into the sky like a tsunami, tearing the turbid clouds and shaking the cold sky. It seems very powerful. Huai Shi, who existed as a mascot on the huge city wall, looked down at the fanatical and restless army below and couldn't help but sigh. At least the voice is loud. It seems that the food treatment is pretty good. Hey, buddy, do you have steam buns here? I didn't eat enough this morning. The monk waiting in front of him had a bitter look on his face and didn't know how to answer. Beside him, Jonathan had begun to get used to his unconventional style. He rolled his eyes and didn't speak. The other dozen or so great spirits who had been recruited glanced over when they heard the words. Those giant beasts, big and small, felt the ferocious aura on Huai Shi and the strange iron pillar wrapped around his tail behind him. Their eyes became slightly fearful. No one spoke. Amidst the silence, only a giant bear covered in flames arrived late. It lazily greeted its companions, and when it saw the giant bell hanging in front of Huai Shi's chest, it couldn't help but have a mocking look on its face. "Oh, my friend, the dog bell is not bad." The giant bear giggled. "It's quite cute, ha ha." Huai Shi smiled carelessly and glanced back at him. "Then I'll give you one later." Behind him, the tail wrapped around the iron pillar slowly shrank, creating a series of dazzling sparks in the harsh sound of friction and the sound of steel wailing. The giant bear's smile stiffened for a moment. Then it immediately shrank back and didn't speak. Only Huai Shi still looked like a dog with a faint smile. He stood at the forefront and looked at the city in the distance. In the middle of these messy mountains divided by the Rift Valley, there was a high platform riddled with holes. It was the size of 2 or 3 cities, but now was full of cracks. More than half of it had been uprooted. After the chaos of war, it was probably left for the giant beasts to fight. Even a place was prepared for you, afraid that you wouldn't have a good fight. This was really too king considerate. Just as Huai Shi was looking at the giant beasts in the surrounding cities, the other giant beasts in the high places were also looking at him. When they saw the body size that could be considered huge among all the giant beasts, all the explorers couldn't help but gasp. This kid was so terrifying that he couldn't be left alive. But just as everyone was hesitating whether or not to focus fire on him in the first wave of attacks, they saw a pair of signature ice blue eyes, a classic black and white color scheme, and a tongue that stuck out from the corner of his mouth. He noticed that something was wrong from the line of saliva hanging in front of his chest. Wait a minute, where the hell did this giant armored husky come from? Many giant beasts breathed a sigh of relief. It was a false alarm. With such a husky in the opposite camp, well, for some reason, everyone felt particularly safe. They were afraid that before the fight started, the other side would tear down their home by themselves, right? However, there were still a few more cautious giant beasts who were not at ease. They looked at the gray penguin hidden in the fog in the team. "Twin Moon, can you see anything?" The giant penguin known as Twin Moon had bright eyes and slender eyebrows, looking particularly domineering. After hearing the words, he fixed his eyes on Huai Shi in the distance and couldn't help but sneer. His mind is simply unguarded. "Let me see, he's thinking now." Twin Moon narrowed his eyes and read word by word. "Who am I?" He was stunned for a moment. When he narrowed his eyes and looked carefully again, he saw a few big words hovering in Huai Shi's mind. "Where am I? What king am I going to do?" "Okay." In the awkward silence, the giant beasts retracted their gazes, feeling that there was something wrong with their brains for them to be wary of a purebred husky. Only Huai Shi looked around at the other giant beasts with a blank face. He noticed that the premonition of death suddenly came and disappeared. He didn't know what happened at all. "I feel like someone is going to harm me." He secretly asked Fu Yi, "Do you have any clues?" "How would I know?" The stoat, who was tired of brainwashing, rolled her eyes. "Maybe it's because you're born beautiful?" "Makes sense." Huai Shi nodded in agreement. Chapter 341. Not to mention Huaishur, who was smugly swinging his tongue in the wind, thinking that he was a natural beauty. In a solemn atmosphere, accompanied by the sharp sound of countless gears turning, the gates leading to the great rift valley opened layer by layer. Like a torrent, the aberrated lizards gathered into a formation and marched toward the deep valley battlefield that had already been dyed red with blood. In the other fortresses that were waiting for battle, a gate also opened with a loud bang. Victory! 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 A roaring voice came from inside. For the Supreme Emperor. Then, iron boots trampled on the ground, and the neat steel formation was accompanied by low footsteps as it slowly advanced forward. Huaishur's eyes widened. Damn, a Roman phalanx? And it was a group of kobolds. That's right, it was a group of kobolds wearing iron armor, holding spears and large shields, and carrying short swords at their waists, looking at the color of their fur. It was a group of border shepherds. Amazing. At this moment, they came closer and saw Huaishur on the wall, and they couldn't help but look at each other. It was as if they had seen their own family. It was especially like a ritual of a fellow townsman meeting a fellow townsman and shooting a spear in the back. There was no time for each other to be emotional and sad. As the old priest on the city wall raised the banner high, a shrill scream rang out. The aberrated lizards below the city wall burned with red eyes in the fragrant incense. They fanatically chanted hymns and charged toward the border shepherd's phalanx. When these aberrated lizards ran, their bloated and deformed feet trampled on the ground, not afraid of the mud and harsh terrain. It was as if they were riding some kind of mount. They were very fast, and in an instant, they had already rushed into the kobold's phalanx in a mess with their weapons raised high. Like an ugly tide crashing on a crazy reef, gray, black, white, and red burst out in an instant. The corner of Huaishur's eyes twitched. What happened? Fu-Yi shrank in the bell and couldn't see what happened below. She was a little anxious. Everyone is having a get-together. The situation is very happy, so much so that some things that kittens shouldn't see happened. Huaishur raised his paw and simply blocked the hole in the bell. It blocked out the nauseating stench of blood. If one looked at it from afar, the tragic scene looked more like colors dancing in dirty water. However, when paired with the screams, roars, and hymns, it was exceptionally ferocious and frenzied. The ugliest scenes in the world were unfolding before the eyes of the explorers in the most blatant way. Even though both sides were lizard men and kobolds, which made it difficult for others to empathize with them, Huaishur still felt extremely uncomfortable. At the same time, he also experienced that familiar hunger. That was the instinctive call of his body. Just like Van Helsing, he was desperate for blood. Huaishur easily suppressed this impulse that did not belong to him. He allowed his eyes to burn red and remained motionless. However, the other giant beasts could no longer bear it. Their sharp claws scratched the bricks on the city wall, and sparks burst out in ear-piercing sounds. In the smell of fresh blood, they gradually became thirsty. The other cities were still holding back their troops, coldly watching the two armies offer the first bloody sacrifice for the eternal war in the most tragic way. The first to be unable to hold back was actually the explorers on the other side. As the city gate opened with a bang, the kobold phalanx that was about to collapse seemed to have received an order from the sharp horn sound. They cleanly split into two, opening up a straight path. He let the oppressive hurricane ring out in the midst of his earth-shaking run. The earth trembled under the charge of the iron-gray, giant rhinoceros. It was as if an overly exaggerated armor truck had suddenly barged into a paddy field. Amidst the high-pitched roar of the engine, the straw was easily destroyed, pierced, and torn into pieces. Bathed in the debris and blood of the corpses, the bloodthirsty giant rhinoceros roared excitedly. It suddenly slammed into the gate of the Lizard King city, leaving a deep dent. It seemed to understand that it would be difficult to break through this pure steel gate in a short time, so it simply turned around and crushed the lizard fanatics behind it. The whales played the climax of the tyrannical war. The blood-soaked giant rhinoceros laughed maniacally as it trampled, easily crushing insignificant blisters as it galloped in the pitch black and crimson mud. On the city wall, the old shaman's face had turned from pale to blood red. It was simply a miracle. The lizardmen seemed to be cold-blooded animals. Suddenly, it raised a banner in its hand and looked back at the great spirits on its side on the city wall with a serious and expectant expression. It was as if an old general on the stage was devising a strategy before the battle. It was only short of asking, "Who can take this bastard's head for me? Leave the first battle to me." In a row at the very front, a huge white deer stepped on clouds, and mist slowly rose a little. It stepped forward and floated toward the battlefield with a mysterious and unfathomable calm smile. It was as if the heavens had sent a child to subdue the evil creature below. There was no smoke or fire as it rose and fell. Huaisha could not help but want to praise its excellent qigong. Then it came back again. Except for its head, the rest of its body was forever left on the battlefield. When they were torturing the weak in the beginning, no one felt that the iron-gray rhinoceros was very strong. But now that the white deer went down and was about to show off its martial arts skills, they did not expect that the rhinoceros would suddenly appear in front of them. In an instant, it sprinted and then sprinted again. The second sprint, the body that was like a truck broke through the speed of sound and set off a thunderous roar. It did not need any other weapons. Its terrifying mass and hardshell were already the best weapons. Suddenly, the white deer that seemed to have a mysterious trump card was blasted into a pile of mush from the middle, as if it was hit by the Dora cannon of Rome. Its four legs were flung in all directions. Half of its neck and head flew into the sky like a hammer. Blood splattered everywhere as it returned to the city wall. It smashed into the rock next to the old shaman. A pile of mush was almost embedded in the rock. He was definitely deader than dead. In an instant, other than the laughter of the giant rhinoceros below the city wall, there was a dead silence on the city wall. The old shaman's face turned red and white and green, green and purple. It spun around like a color palette on a Photoshop. Trembling, he turned back and looked at the other big spirits. His mouth was trembling with anger. He could not speak, but the meaning was clearly expressed. Who was next? All the giant beasts could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. Oh my! Everyone thought that the ones who went up at the beginning were all Wang Lingguan and the like to make up the numbers. In the end, the other side threw a trump card and invited the master of the Erlang Temple. It was a good start. Red was red, but here it was a white matter. And the most important question was, who was next? For a moment, due to all kinds of concerns, the giant beasts on the city wall did not come out to deal with it. Instead, they all shrank back a little. Everyone looked left and right, wanting to shift the blame. But for some reason, in the end, their gazes gradually turned to Huaisha, who was the biggest and fiercest. "Big brother, it seems that you are the strongest," a green jackal-like creature suggested. "Why don't you go first? That's a bit too much for you." Huaisha looked serious for a long time and pointed to the Roman square below. "Everyone is a dog. It's not easy for me to do it. Now you remember that you are from the same family." Even though many people had prepared a lot of lines, Huaisha was so blatantly shameless that they didn't know how to respond to her. Then, behind the group of beasts, there was a disdainful and fearless voice. "TSK, all a bunch of cowards. Get out of the way and let me do it." In an instant, the beasts turned around in shock and saw the flaming giant bear who had shrunk to the back. There was no doubt that it should be him, whether it was the direction or the voice. For a moment, they all looked at the giant bear with admiration. "You are so brave." "What?" The flaming giant bear looked blank, as if it did not know what had happened. Seeing that everyone was looking at it, it suddenly panicked and quickly waved its bare paw. I didn't say that. Don't be humble, go." "That's right. I heard it clearly. When it comes to fighting, the bears of Ardaluo country are not afraid of anyone." Huaisha shouted and clapped his paw. "It's you." The giant bear's face turned purple, and it could not speak clearly. "I didn't say that I would go." In the group of beasts, Huaisha said, "So what you said just now was just to tease everyone." For a moment, the eyes of all the giant beasts became dangerous. Jonathan did not mind the drama and added, "Why don't we give him a hand?" Then, the eyes of the giant beast became more dangerous. The flaming bear could no longer recommend. Its originally sad and indignant expression twitched, as if it had accepted the reality and found that it was not bad at all. 30 years to the east, 30 years to the west. Don't look down on a poor young man. When it killed the good-for-nothing below, who would dare to look down on it like this? It gritted its teeth and stomped its feet. Ambition rose in its heart, and it roared. In an instant, the flames on its body rose more than 10 meters high. It rushed forward 2 steps and directly jumped onto the battlefield. In midair, there was a long roar. "Such trash, I want to fight 10 more." Such a domineering declaration not only stunned Huai Shi and the others, but also the giant beasts on the city wall who were watching the battle. For a moment, the explorers who were suspicious of it could not help but be impressed by its majestic spirit. They all exclaimed, "Amazing! He just said that he was modest, I can see that." Yes. I knew he was super brave. Only Jonathan saw it clearly. He glanced at the bell on Huai Shi's neck intentionally or unintentionally, and there was a trace of fear in his heart. The new generation excels the old. Young girls nowadays, when they learn bad things, even the uncles are afraid of them. Thinking of this, he wanted to say something, but stopped. He did not know if he should tell Huai Shi about his discovery. Huai Shi's intuition was sharp, and he quickly looked over in confusion. "What's wrong?" Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, but suddenly there was a vibration in front of his eyes. The chat box in the plug-in popped up. It was Fui. For some reason, when he saw this understated emoji, Jonathan stiffened. Immediately, he awkwardly squeezed out a smile at Huai Shi. "No, nothing." Thus the chat box coldly closed. It was not until a long time after Huai Shi withdrew his gaze that Jonathan let out a long breath. Under his scales, he was covered in cold sweat. He suddenly remembered the look in Fu Yi's eyes when she last appeared. That kind of calm expression that seemed to understand what he was hiding, but did not seem to care. It was like saying, "Do whatever you want, as long as you don't disturb her playing the game." Thinking of this, the tip of the rock lizard's tail twitched slightly. That is, if the most dangerous creature here wasn't the evolved version of the forgetful husky, he suddenly had a bad feeling in his heart. How many people here had been implanted by her? He finally noticed the pair of indifferent eyes that had been spying on him in the dark all the time. He sucked in a breath of cold air. One of the implied instructions: you cannot betray Fu Yi. Chapter 342. First, there was a boom, then a duong, and finally a slap. It was over. The giant beasts on the city wall couldn't help but shrink their necks. Squeak. It was too cruel. It was teaching children bad things. The process was very simple. Brother Fire Bear fell from the sky and landed on the ground. Brother Fire Bear spat out flames and was hit by the giant rhinoceros. Brother Fire Bear died. It died so miserably. It was smashed into a pile of mush. Given that he was a decent bear before his death, after the giant rhinoceros killed him, it carefully stepped on him into meat paste and spat on the bear's skin with a look of disdain. "You want to fight 10 of us?" That was the consequence of being stubborn. The giant rock rhinoceros, which had transformed for the second time, laughed and began to gallop toward the remaining lizard fanatics. On the city wall, the high priest looked defeated and fell to the ground. He couldn't even hold the flag that represented his power. He had no choice. He didn't have anyone who could fight. Life was too difficult. The great lizard kingdom was about to be finished. It didn't matter if he died, but how could he face the previous emperors and popes after he died? On the city wall, all the giant beasts felt ashamed. Jonathan sighed. His body floated up slightly as he prepared to descend into a mess. At most, he could crush that guy in the air and quickly float back. But as soon as he floated up, he was pressed to the ground by Huai Shi. "Let me do it." The dog-like giant husky flicked its tongue to get rid of the saliva. It then stretched its neck and waist as a warm-up. He just said that he could go up. He also felt that it was time to show off. "Brother, can you do it?" At the front, the coral eagle with the giant tree and strange flower on its back looked at him with worry. If you can't do it, I'll do it. Don't send yourself to death. I'll do it. Don't worry. Huaisher swayed his tail and left the iron pillar on the city wall. He ran to the edge of the city wall, grabbed the edge, and jumped. But he didn't jump into the air as expected. His feet slipped. The rock that he was using as a stepping stone had already loosened. It was sent flying when he stepped on it. It was not able to support him at all. Thus, everyone saw the giant husky waving its limbs in a sorry state as it plummeted straight down. With a thud, his head hit the ground and fell into the mud in the valley. F***CK. When Huaisher finally pulled his head out of the mud, he shook his head violently to get rid of the mud. He turned around angrily and shouted at the high priest on the city wall, "The public facilities should be repaired. If not, people might die." The high priest's face was full of panic. He waved his hand and shouted something at Huaisher, but Huaisher could not hear him clearly. He could only vaguely make out that he seemed to be saying that there was something behind him. What? What was it? Huaisher turned around in astonishment, and then saw the black shadow of the giant rhinoceros rapidly enlarging in front of his eyes with a roar that broke through the air. Boom! With a loud bang, Huaisher flew backward. With a thud, he smashed into the wall and could not be pulled out. There were sounds of sneering from all around. The giant beasts watching on the city wall fell into silence. In the dead silence, someone let out a helpless sigh. "What are you doing? If you can't do it, then don't send me off." Then, in the deep valley, a shrill scream rang out. But the sound did not come from Huaisher. It came from the giant rhinoceros. Right where it was, the giant rhinoceros, covered in rock armor, let out a tragic roar and staggered back. It was only now that it felt a deep pain coming from the tip of its nose. On the bridge of its nose, the two sharp horns had been broken off. It crashed into Huaisher's carapace and shattered it. "Are you an idiot?" Huaisher, who was embedded in the city wall, pulled himself out as if nothing had happened. He twisted his sore waist, turned around, and looked at the huge crack on the carapace at his waist. It was as if he had been hit by a train. The crystallization of metallurgy created by the alchemy fire in his soul, the high-density alloy armor, had two cracks. It was not easy. Although Huaisher certainly did not have the skill to do the molecular level operation of the original technology under the rough production, the performance was barely half of the original product. Seeing the cracks on the armor, Huaisher did not feel distressed. He raised his head, took a breath, and then, with a hete sound, spat out a mouthful of molten iron to seal the cracks. "Come, let's continue." After being hit by the impact that was comparable to a cannonball, Huaisher staggered up as if nothing had happened and grinned at the giant rhinoceros not far away. "You just had a good time. Now it's my turn, right? You. The giant rhinoceros staggered back in disbelief. It could not believe that Huaisher was still alive and kicking. Even if there was armor, the internal organs inside should have been rotten into a pile of smelly sauce. How could he still get up? Huaisher was too lazy to explain to it the buffer layer technology, the thick internal fat, and the internal organs that could even digest metal. Knowledge is power. Do you understand? The wolf beast said shamelessly. In the next moment, its four limbs trampled on the mud. A roar burst forth, and the earth suddenly shook. The soft mud seemed to be stronger than steel under its trampling. It was only after he broke through the air that he weakly whined and flew in all directions. Violent ripples were set off from the blood and mud. The hurricane roared and broke out, and then it was torn apart by Huaisher's sharp claws. The giant rhinoceros suddenly retreated. Without any warning, its speed was fast, but Huaisher was even faster. Under the unreasonable giant beast's physique, his four limbs instantly burst forth with the 4 steps of you, as if 4 jet engines were installed. The iron-cast wolf head hung down, revealing the 2 sharp horns, and brazenly crashed forward. Dog escaped secret skill, iron head. Boom! Waves of air burst forth. The giant beast's collision set off a huge wave, and with a roar, it burst out in all directions. The rhinoceros screamed and was sent flying, rolling in the mud like a sausage rolling on the ground. It smashed into the square formation of the kobolds and crushed a large number of Huai Shi's family members. Huai Shi also stood in place. He was stunned. "How brave are you?" Fu Yi, who was in the bell, was already shaking so much that she was about to vomit. "Aren't you afraid of a concussion?" After a long time, Huai Shi finally reacted. The darkness in front of his eyes faded, and he spat out a mouthful of saliva. He actually saw a trace of blood. Only now did he remember that the effect of force was mutual. No matter how iron the dog's head was, it couldn't withstand his headbutt. If his bones were a little more brittle, he would have simply died on the spot. After a low whine, the rhinoceros actually got up from the ground again. However, 2 bloody holes had appeared on his skin. A few bones were broken, but it was not a serious injury. Looking at Huai Shi's sorry state, it grinned and laughed mockingly. "What's wrong? Idiot! Don't you like to crash? Come on." Its 4 hooves dug into the ground and regrouped. It lowered its head towards Huai Shi and made a charging posture. "If you don't come over," 2 streams of thick air came out of its nostrils. Its eyes were blood red, and it grinned hideously. "Then I'll go over." With a roar, it launched a fearless charge towards Huai Shi again. Last time, it underestimated Huai Shi's strength. This time, even if it had to crash, it would crash Huai Shi into their wall. The hurricane howled, and a loud roar sounded. But Huai Shi seemed to be stunned. He stood in place without moving, as if waiting for it to crash into him. Only at the last moment did he grin and smile evilly. "Who wants to compete with a free player like you?" The wolf beast howled to the sky. "Sword come." Inside the bell, Fu Yi sighed helplessly and waved her claws. On the city wall, the iron pile that Huai Shi had thrown to the ground suddenly shook. Then, it split from the middle to the sides, revealing the heavy and ferocious cold blade. The snake spine Apei, which was made of the spine of a giant snake and steel, suddenly shook. As if responding to its master's call, it soared into the sky and whistled towards Huai Shi. The strangely long blade swept around. As Huai Shi opened his mouth and bit the hilt, the brutal long blade extended from Huai Shi's mouth to the right. Facing the charging rhinoceros, Huai Shi brazenly swung his sword. The giant rhinoceros passed by. Tragic screams could be heard. Blood soared into the sky, almost drenching most of the city wall behind Huai Shi Scarlet. The giant rhinoceros had already crashed into the wall with a bang. From his face to his back, a deep slash mark appeared. In the dead silence, the giant beasts on the city walls were dumbfounded. The 3 questions in life surfaced in their minds. What's going on? What the hell is this? What did you do? What the F***CK is this sword? Aren't we in the monster world? You're making a fool of yourself, bro. Moreover, where the F***CK did you get the sword control technique? On the opposite side, the Emperor Penguin, Twin Moons, who was the first to react, frowned. That guy has psychokinesis. Everyone, be careful. Mental power. Among the many transformations of the remains, only a few could awaken this ability. However, all of them were strange and terrifying. However, the exotic beasts that awaken mental power were usually the type with weak bodies. Where the F***CK did such a detestable big boss pop out from? Huai Shi had been strengthening the ceiling hand day and night. The seemingly crude snake spine sword had long been strengthened to plus 13. Under the bone-like exterior, it had been infiltrated by molten iron. The alloy had fused with the mutated bones from the outside, and there was no distinction between them. Instead of saying that it was a snake bone, it would be better to say that it was a new alloy forged from snake bones. As for the blade, Huai Shi secretly attached the sacrificial knife to it. After attaching the blood-sucking attribute, the blade was boundlessly fast. Amidst the wailing, the giant rhinoceros slowly got up. It raised its huge bloodshot eyes and stared at Huai Shi. With a roar, it charged again. However, its speed became slower and slower. In the end, it no longer had any strength. It slid into the mud and stopped in front of Huai Shi. It lost its breath. It was dead. In the dead silence, Huaishur held the sword in his mouth and could not help but look up to the sky and sigh. Being able to die under my soaring heaven's dragon flash is a blessing that you've cultivated in your previous life. A gentle breeze blew past. The expert was lonely. A line of saliva leaked out from the corner of his mouth. Chapter 343. Perhaps the visual impact of the sword manipulation technique was too strong, but after the giant rhinoceros disappeared, everyone froze in place and didn't speak. In the dead silence, only the wolf beast with the demeanor of a master stood in place with its head held high. Bathed in the bloody wind, drooling, the scene was particularly strange. No one knew the helpless conversation that only existed in the consciousness. Fu-E, don't you think it's too much to steal my kill like this? Oh, it was too close, so I couldn't help but break it. Don't do this again. Fu-E rolled her eyes and said in a trembling voice, I'll steal the next one too. Okay, I'll give them all to you. Life wasn't easy. Huaishur sighed. Anyway, it wasn't the first time that his kill had been stolen, and he had long been used to it. The problem now was, where could he find another one? Hey, is anyone there? He raised his head and looked at the opposite city wall. How about another one? In the silence, the giant beast looked coldly at the husky below, and no one spoke. Who knew if this thing hit a rocket launcher called Doghead Dragon Flash in addition to the big sword called Heavenly Soaring Dragon Flash? Those who played tactics had dirty hearts. The eternal battle had just begun, and no one was willing to go down and lay down before seeing the other side's details. Thus, the husky became more and more proud. It casually spat out the sword in its mouth, stretched its neck, and shouted 3 times, Who dares to kill me? Who dares to kill me? Who dares to kill me? Fu-E couldn't help but cover her face in the bell. You might as well shout, I'm still brave and courageous. That's right. Huaishur's eyes lit up. Red hair among men, Lu Bu among dogs. How could he not be Lu Bu? Be careful. This is called White Gate Tower. I beg you, can you change to a more normal style? But why aren't they coming down? Huaishur sighed and looked around. Under those cold gazes, he tilted his head and thought for a while, then suddenly said, Why don't I perform for everyone? How about singing a song? Enough! On top of the city wall, an amber crocodile, lying on the edge, finally couldn't take it anymore. It opened its mouth and said, Since that embarrassing thing over there doesn't want to fight, why don't we just do it over here? From her voice, she seemed to be a domineering big sister. Danny, don't worry. Below the city wall, behind the slowly rising city gate, an old voice rang out. Let this old man meet it. Accompanied by a hoarse voice, a vigorous figure slowly appeared behind the open city gate, reflecting a golden light. At that moment, Huaishur froze in place. This distinctive yellow and white coat color, bright short hair, and curly tail. It was actually Huaishur's family. But then again, isn't this just firewood? The giant wolf beast's face twitched, and its eyes widened. It crouched down and scrutinized the rather calm senior. What happened to you, old man? Can you give me one too? Old Chai's face twitched, and for a moment, he couldn't tell whether Huaishur was envious or mocking him. Can I touch your tail? Huaishur blinked and raised its paw. It's really cute swaying here and there. Enough. The Shiba Inu was furious, and its old voice was full of uncontrollable anger. Don't you know how to respect your seniors? But you're really cute. The giant husky raised its paw and patted Old Chai's head. We're both dogs. What's wrong with letting me touch you? Bang! The sharp sound of steel colliding burst forth. Huaishur's vision blurred. He only felt a flash of lightning, and a deep scratch appeared on the scales and carapace on his neck. The Shiba Inu, with rising lightning, stood behind Huaishur and said indifferently, Next time, it won't be at the level of greeting. Kid, pick up your sword. It was so fast. Huaishur turned back in surprise and looked at the Shiba Inu, who seemed to be wearing lightning clothes. Why do both of you have skills? Both humans and ghosts were showing off. He was the only one who could do nothing except spitting everywhere. Wasn't it too much? He waved his tail, which was like a long whip with sharp edges and corners, lightly wrapped around the hilt of the sword. He pulled it out and waved it twice, bursting out a sharp whistling sound. This was the real use of the sword. After all, it was too troublesome to hold it with the mouth, and it was easy to drool, which was really not in line with Huaishi's expected demeanor of a master. In the quagmire, Huaishi took a deep breath and moved his muscles and bones. The scales rubbed together like steel. In the burst of sparks, the sharp sound rose one after another, but it couldn't cover the low sound of bones stretching. The Shiba Inu was stunned for a moment, as if it was an illusion. The wolf beast in front of him seemed to be a little bigger. Where did this monster come from? Could it grow taller just by drinking the wind? What kind of remains did it use, and how many transformations did it undergo to strengthen to such a degree? Generally speaking, after the transformation, the giant beasts would develop different specialties according to the different attributes of the remains and the direction of their own development. They would either become bigger, harder, faster, or have the ability to use all kinds of source substances. Even a more strange power like psychokinesis could develop with the development of special organs. But where did this hexagonal warrior come from? Its body was as big as a heavy truck, and its strength was terrifying. Its physique was strong enough to withstand the impact of the giant rhinoceros, and its defense was even exaggerated and scary. Just now, it was ready to directly cut Huaishi's throat with its speed and lightning attack, which it was most proud of when Huaishi wasn't paying attention. But after the attack, it found that even the weakest part of this guy was covered with a layer of dense scales, not to mention the greenish-gray skin below that was shining with a metallic light. It was a giant wolf made of metal. Could it be the work of a creator? Shiba Inu thought quickly and suddenly understood. If the explorers were tools, then the creator was the true controller of these tools, as well as the main driving force of this Night of the Witches. He was the one who really played a game with the creator who created the Witches' Night. These days, he had seen many explorers who had been modified and experimented by the creators outside the realm. Among them, there were many tragic failures and monsters that were directly eroded and solidified by the abyss during the transformation. But those who succeeded all had incredible powers and specialties, far surpassing other explorers who relied on their instincts to transform randomly. If this guy in front of him was a spokesperson specially created by a creator, it made sense. "Hey, sir," a curious voice suddenly sounded in his ear. "What are you thinking about?" For a moment, Shiba Inu was horrified. The giant wolf beast in the distance broke through the air in an instant and came in front of him, close at hand. It tilted its head curiously and looked at his absent-minded face, which made his hair stand on end. Why would I let my imagination run wild when I'm facing the enemy? I've actually overlooked the enemy. It swiftly retreated like a bolt of lightning, widening the distance between them once more. Then it abruptly lunged forward. In the blink of an eye, it was as if a blinding bolt of lightning had drawn a sharp edge in the void. It stared straight at Huaishi's eyes. He only needed one strike to cripple this dog's eyes. But if I kill it, will I incur the wrath of the creator? The sudden thought in his mind made his movements slow down for a moment. Then he felt a sharp pain in his claws, as if he had hit an iron wall. Because Huaishi closed his eyes. It was like a fly hitting a glass. There wasn't even a light sound. Even the hardness of his eyelids was like armor. He was shocked, but the electric light on his body became more and more violent, and he attacked Huaishi again. Since the speed just now was not enough, he would speed up again. Boom! The hurricane roared. Before Shiba Inu could take any action, the wolf beast stepped through the air and whistled. Even without the acceleration of the lightning, it caught up with Shiba Inu's speed. How could it be so fast? Shiba Inu was terrified and tried to fight back, but suddenly a strange idea came to his mind. What should I eat tonight? No, it doesn't matter what I eat tonight, right? It's all meat anyway. But is it because I've been eating too much meat recently, so it's not suitable for my health? Maybe I should eat vegetables occasionally? But is there really fresh vegetables in this place? Speaking of which, didn't those people in the underground world combine plants and creatures in the abyss? I wonder how it's going. No, Why am I thinking about this? When he came to his senses, he saw Huai Shi turn around elegantly, kicking the ground with his front legs and swinging his body out, together with the sharp sword hanging on his tail. The iron light flashed, and the whistling wind sounded like the roar of a banshee. Shiba Inu rolled into the quagmire awkwardly, gasping for breath. Just a little bit more, and I would have been cut in half by the sword that was bigger than me. If it was outside, how could he be afraid of something like this? It was just steel. But how did they make such pure steel? Could it be that they also knew metallurgy? Or did he use some other method? There is no coal here. I should have explored this place. Only beast blood and a few kinds of oily plants can be used as fuel. But how did that guy make an armor? Is he cheating? Or is there something I didn't notice? Boom. Shiba Inu flew backward. Being distracted in a battle was obviously suicidal. Even the giant beasts on the city wall noticed that something was wrong. What's going on? Isn't Old Lee from an archaeological team? Seems like he's not in the right state. If it's used well, no one should be able to catch up with its speed. Is he suppressed? Didn't you notice? That guy's probably using psychokinesis, right? As soon as Shuang Yu's voice fell, he suddenly understood. Psychokinesis itself was such a disgusting effect. Even as a soul ability, it only appeared a few times in the sublimator. According to its nature, the way it was performed was completely different. Some added a vector to an object out of thin air, while some seemed to turn the will from invisible to tangible, pulling and moving out of thin air, and so on. There were even more strange and peculiar uses that were impossible to guard against. The deliberately loud voice was also heard by the Shiba Inu under the city wall. Suddenly, the old man was nervous. If used properly, at such a close distance, even his heart could be crushed from the inside. That guy didn't seem to notice. No. Is it difficult to perform such a precise operation? Or is he deliberately teasing me? No, if it's just psychokinesis, his mind was racing. Suddenly, he caught a glimmer of light from the countless surging thoughts. This is a soul attack. He's controlling my consciousness and thoughts. The momentary delay caused by the horror slowed him down for a moment. Then, under Huai Shi's sharp claws, he flew backward, blood spurting from his mouth and nose. He was seriously injured, but the physical injury was incomparable to the impact on his soul. His heart was cold. A giant beast that was almost a hexagonal warrior was good at soul attacks. That's terrifying. It didn't matter even if he died here. He had to tell everyone in midair. He made up his mind. Enduring the pain, he turned around, jumped up, and dodged Huai Shi's pouncing. He flexibly propped himself up with his claws on his back, jumped, and shouted at his companions on the city wall not far away. Everyone, listen to me, Dash. The Shiba Inu stared and roared with all his might, shouting words that even he couldn't understand. We are all dogs. Second hint, you can't tell Fu Yi's secret. Chapter 344. Suddenly, the Shiba Inu ascended to the sky and made a deafening announcement. Dead silence followed. On the city wall, all the giant beasts looked at each other, confused. Was the dog barking? Although it was indeed a dog barking, why did it suddenly jump up and bark at everyone? Was it just to scold them? Was it trying to take revenge on the world after being single for so long? Not only were the people on the city wall confused, but even the Shiba Inu itself was stunned in midair. Immediately, its heart turned cold. It could no longer make a sound. It looked back at Huai Shi, who was squatting on the ground with its mouth wide open, trying to catch a piece of meat. Its heart was full of despair. Among the lizard men, Jonathan, the crystalline lizard, had already realized what was going on. However, he was still terrified by the strange power that Fu Yi had displayed. Which creator was controlling the situation behind the scenes? Why was there such an exaggerated power? Thinking of Fu Yi's small body size, he became more and more confused. Living creatures had their limits. Such an extreme way of adding points meant that she had to rely on her teammates. Otherwise, anyone present would have to leave immediately after a simple attack. Then, Huai Shi had to guard against others attacking Fu Yi. Perhaps some people from the astronomy club had already realized what was going on. After all, this kind of thing only needed to take a look at the map. He looked down at the map on the plug-in and froze in place. Immediately, for the first time, he realized that lizard men could sweat. Cold sweat. What the hell? Jonathan sucked in a breath of cold air. He couldn't see Fu Yi's name. She had disappeared from the astronomy club's map. When did it start? He didn't notice it at all. He had clearly seen it this morning. No. If he looked carefully, there seemed to be a layer of translucent handwriting, but it overlapped under Huai Shi's name. The two people were too close. The size of the map was limited. This kind of cheating plug-in couldn't be convenient enough to adjust the scale at will. As a result, when Fu Yi's translucent name overlapped with Huai Shi's, no one could imagine that the layer of blurry pattern below actually represented another explorer. But what did this mean? White names represented ordinary explorers. Light green names represented members of the Astronomy Association. Dark green names represented core scholars and explorers who had been given the right to cheat, and black names represented death. But why was it translucent? He fell into confusion. He completely ignored the wailing of the Shiba Inu in the distance. As the wolf beast's iron teeth closed, the Shiba Inu was instantly covered in blood. It didn't know where it got the strength to break free from Huai Shi's 3 or 4 rows of sharp teeth, but its 2 hind legs and tail had been cut off. It looked very miserable. It couldn't help but cry out, "Despicable." Someone who even copied the emoji pack doesn't have the right to say that. Huai Shi directly spat out the powder and molten iron in front of him, like a heavenly girl scattering flowers in the sky. "You're too shameless. I'm going to punish you on behalf of the legal department." The great sword swept across. The iron light flashed. Perhaps it was the good brothers of the legal department who bestowed justice from the unseen world. The Shiba Inu was immediately killed. It was clear that it was dead. Then Huai Shi suddenly felt an indescribable itch in his throat, as if tens of millions of feathers were sweeping around in his throat. He couldn't help but want to dig them out with his claws. He couldn't help but sneeze. There was a boom. A ball of flame mixed with sparks was spewed out. With the bad breath of not brushing teeth for a long time, it spread around and formed a vague outline in the air. Well, it looked like a lion. It was on fire as if it had been ignited, and it was screaming, "F***, it's real." Huai Shi was startled. He didn't know why he could sneeze out a lion. Oh my God, did he become a piccolo who vomited to give birth? Then, the lion's eyes were no longer restrained. It suddenly pounced on Huai Shi. Hiding here, he planned to take advantage of the battle between the giant wolf and the Shiba Inu to injure both of them, and then take advantage of the situation. He didn't expect that Huai Shi would sneeze at him, but now he had entered his attack range. At the moment when Huai Shi was stunned, the lion suddenly opened its mouth. A shadow of a giant mouth appeared in the air and fell on Huai Shi. It suddenly closed. It was so close. The lion was furious and couldn't believe it. At the moment when its giant mouth closed, it seemed to have bitten a small stone. It was blocked by an invisible barrier for a moment, and then Huai Shi pulled away. And in the place where the shadow of the giant mouth covered, there was a deep depression in the ground. In the depression, whether it was stones, plants, mushrooms, rhinoceros wreckage, or even mud, they were all perfectly cut into a hemispherical shape. The cut was as smooth as a mirror. Huai Shi's face was deformed. Envious. Why don't I have such a cool trick? He raised his lemon-red eyes and stared at the stunned lion. Then, Huai Shi took a deep breath. He spat out the sourness of the lemon in his heart, the fear of escaping death, and the last trace of itchiness in his throat. A dazzling white light spewed out from his mouth. It was iron. Burning iron. The originally sticky molten iron turned into a dazzling molten iron mist, which was difficult to look at directly, and swept out from Huai Shi's mouth. In an instant, the rich hot silver light swallowed the lion. The scream burst out suddenly and stopped abruptly, when a gust of wind swept away the rapidly condensing red iron sand. Only the charred corpse of the lion was left. Oh my God! Huai Shi was overjoyed. Fu, did you see that? I have a new skill. It's so cool. It's my turn to be the emperor this year. I finally have a new skill. After a long time of brewing, through the unreasonable method of fighting, Huaishi's spitting organ in his throat finally developed. The brand new organ hidden behind the tonsils had been connected to Huaishi's blood circulation. It could extract his blood, which had mutated to liquid metal, at any time. After a series of unknown chemical reactions, it would instantly evaporate into boiling iron mist. Together with the spitting, it would form a strong thermite like metal breath. This was much cooler than the original spitting to kill the enemy. Huaishi's tail swung wildly in excitement, swinging the big sword like an electric fan. Then, he felt the ominous gazes around him. The premonition of death suddenly emerged. The moment the Shiba Inu died and the invisible lion was exposed, several swift figures flew out from the various city gates. The great spirits of several countries descended on the battlefield at the same time and launched a brazen attack on Huaishi. Level 3 fighting strength. So terrifying, this kid must not be allowed to live. Allowing a hexagonal warrior to continue to grow stronger on such a suitable battlefield for evolution was not good news for other countries. Under the secret connection of the two moons, not only did they incite the invisible lion, but also other giant beasts who were still watching at the same time realized the threat of this giant husky. Perhaps before he could tear down his house, their house would be torn down by Huaishi. The illusory giant wolf suddenly jumped out from the sudden moonlight and appeared behind Huaishi. Its claws were like knives as it slashed down. Under the mud, dozens of thick tentacles suddenly popped out, entangling Huaishi's limbs and blocking the lethal big sword. Countless insects spurted out like a thick fog from the open city gate, with strong acid dripping from their mouths, directly enveloping everything. A giant crystal spider fell from the sky, its 8 claws piercing into the ground. Then, with a hiss, countless crystal blades crazily protruded from the ground, and before that, Huaishi's roar was faster than them. How many floors does a bag of rice have to be carried? Along with the wolf's roar, Jonathan, who had been paddling on the city wall for a long time, finally received the pre-agreed secret signal. The crystal lizard suddenly floated in the air, hovering above the sky. Its short and slightly funny claws spread out from its bloated body to both sides. The blood that had turned into a magnetic fluid rushed rapidly, bursting with power from the mutated organ in its chest that was like a giant magnet, interfering with the geomagnetic field. The earth roared. Countless stones whistled and flew into the sky. Without any leeway, it soared to the limit that he could bear in an instant. Amidst the roar that shook the earth, the magnetic field and gravity became chaotic, like the undercurrents in the deep sea, rubbing against each other and bursting into dazzling sparks in the void. Going bankrupt in one wave, that power did not act on other people, but directly applied on Huaishi's body. In an instant, the huge pressure almost flattened him. Countless scales rubbed against each other, bursting with sparks and sharp sounds. And Huaishi had already dragged the stone octopus that entangled him underground into the air, flying into the sky along with countless boulders. Before the giant octopus that was baring its fangs and brandishing its claws screamed, it saw a strange smile on Huaishi's dog head underground. Huaishi took a deep breath. Dog's breath, stage 3. Incandescent silver, boiling metal spewed out from Huaishi's mouth, and under Fu Yi's psychokinesis, it turned into a bunch of hot molten iron knives. As Huaishi shook his head wildly, it swept in all directions. Wherever the high-pressure water, cannon-like torrent of metal mist passed, everything was neatly cut into 2 pieces. The octopus that entangled Huaishi was directly cut into pieces, and the terrifying residual heat that spread to the surroundings instantly tore the insects apart, stirred, and evaporated into ashes. The encirclement fell apart in an instant. Huaishi casually grabbed Jonathan, who was exhausted from the air, and threw him back on the city wall. The great spirits of the lizardmen finally reacted and roared angrily into the battlefield. The chaotic battle began. The tragic drama of the eternal war finally played out at this moment. Chapter 345. It was as if an empty football field had suddenly become crowded with people. Nearly 70 to 80 giant beasts instantly filled up the entire crevice. Amidst the rumbling, huge tremors that shook the earth and mountains continuously burst forth. As far as the eye could see, there were ferocious and tragic battles everywhere. Why did they suddenly start fighting? As the instigator of the war, a certain canine creature had no idea. Then, he realized that he seemed to have been blocked by all the group members. It was like a graduation ball in Rome. Amidst the melodious melody, the students had already danced together, and then there was only a damned otaku who couldn't even find a single female classmate. He looked around in a daze amidst the hustle and bustle. No one paid attention to him. He quickly went from being popular to being ignored. Such a complicated mental journey made Huai sure a little stunned. Why didn't anyone come to me? Even when he went to help, he was forced to retreat by the disdainful and resistant gazes of his teammates. Dogs with human heads were not welcomed anywhere. When a giant husky leisurely wandered on the battlefield and looked around in a daze, he suddenly heard the sharp sound of wind in his ears. Huaishur subconsciously tilted his head. He skillfully avoided the murderous intent that was close at hand under the premonition of death. Then, amidst the sharp sound of steel rubbing against each other, a tragic gap appeared on Huaishur's sharp horn on his forehead. It was almost broken. The roar of something breaking through the air only burst forth now. Amidst the howling wind, an arrow made of sharpened bone dug a gap on Huaishur's sharp horn and wedged itself deeply into the wall beside him, leaving behind a crack that was as thick as a thumb. It was bottomless. When Huaishur suddenly turned around, he did not see the archer's shadow. Instead, he heard a scream. It was the painful roar of the armored groundhog. It was filled with disbelief and despair. Under the watchful eyes of everyone on the battlefield, the gray owl that was fighting against it suddenly trembled. Bathed in blood, it laughed maniacally as it welcomed its evolution. But this evolution quickly turned ecstasy into shock, and in the end, it turned into a whale. Like an inflated balloon, the iron-gray giant owl rapidly expanded. Its feathers stood up, but the skin and muscles below quickly deformed and twisted. It was as if he was being parasitized by something strange. The feathers on the upper half of his body quickly fell off. Then, under the twisted and shriveled skin, pustules and stripes that resembled twisted faces appeared. Layer after layer of keratin grew out from the cracked skin, and in the blood, slender mycelium grew rapidly, as if it was absorbing the blood and spreading. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into a monster with half a deformed owl and the other half covered in strange mottled fungi. His tone was full of enthusiasm and anticipation, but it was not clear whether he was cheering for Huaishur or the corruption species. In a shrill cry that resembled a strange laugh, the deformed giant owl spread its wings, and the striped faces on the 3 pairs of wings all showed a ferocious expression. Feeling everyone's encouragement and anticipation, the corruption species hungrily pounced on the pitiful, weak, helpless, and edible giant husky. Then, they heard the crisp sound of Biagi. The deformed giant owl that pounced on Huaishur crashed into the sharp scales of Huaishur, as if it had crashed into an iron wall. Its originally swift speed turned into a huge impact, and its entire body was plastered on the sharp scales. Huaishur felt as if he had been punched. Yes, through the bulletproof vest. Just as Huaishur raised his claws and slammed them down, the giant owl's figure suddenly flashed, disappearing from the spot, and abruptly appearing dozens of meters away. It was as if it had jumped through space. Huaishur turned around and spat at the place where he had just hit. After the blazing heat, the pus and bacteria on the scales instantly disappeared without a trace, and there was no hidden infection. Be careful, my psychokinesis has no effect. Fu Yi's voice rang in his ear. The plugin says that the effect of this skill is called phase kick or something. Phase shift? Huaishir was dumbfounded when she heard this. Was it that high-end? Compared to this, his metal spit was so low-level that it could pierce through the Earth's core. Why was the core technology mastered by others? Then, the deformed giant owl shook again and disappeared from the spot. Huaishir's head was hit by the sound of wind. Bang! The sharp end of the tentacle smashed into Huaishir's throat, and through the thick scales and carapace, it brought a faint impact. HP 1 for Brother Owl's sake. A drop of blood was deducted. It did not break through the defense at all. Even the giant owl that had turned into a beast was stunned in place, in disbelief. Immediately, he saw the wolf beast turn its head impatiently and glance at him from the corner of its eyes. What's the use of doing all this fancy stuff all the time? The steel tail swept across like an iron whip with a low whistling sound. The blade slashed down, almost breaking the speed of sound. Before the giant owl could react, the tentacle was directly cut open from the middle. One turned into two. How nice! But then, Huaishir's decapitation strike actually encountered an obstacle. The hidden arrow that came out of nowhere appeared again, blocking the blade for a moment, allowing the giant owl to calmly phase shift again, appearing on the other side and launching a fierce attack. This time, Huaishir finally felt pain. Through the intact scales and carapace, his attack actually directly affected the inside of Huaishir's body, causing the giant wolf beast to twitch and growl in pain. But when he focused on looking for it, the hidden arrow disappeared without a trace again. He could only hear an illusory, mocking chuckle. This was clearly a trap for Huaishir, hoping that he and the corrosive species would both suffer. No, it would be even better if they both died together. Sensing the cold, mocking gazes of the great spirits around him, Huaishir spat and then opened his mouth, his sharp teeth scraping against the heavy blade. Fiery sparks that made the corners of people's eyes twitched constantly flew from the blade. The sharp sound of steel scraping against each other pierced the clamor of the battlefield. It was as if he was sharpening a blade. The hand of confinement attached the power of the fury axe to one end, and then attached the power of the spear of compassion to the other end. The double-edged sword lit up with a cold, steel light. It was thanks to such a large body that Huaishir had the luxury of origin substances to squander. Finally, Huaishir spat out a mouthful of molten iron and smeared it on the blade, burning it until it was bright red. Attribute damage addition complete. Laughing at me, huh? He grinned mockingly and looked around. Finally, his gaze fell on the giant owl that had sensed the danger. He suddenly asked, "Do you know that in the idiom do whatever you want, there's another way to make you invincible?" The giant owl had no idea that the giant husky was talking about the three little ones, but the bone-piercing sense of danger was getting stronger. Then, it saw the giant wolf slowly lower its body, as if accumulating strength. Its muscles contracted, causing the heat under its scales to rise like an oven. It grinned ferociously and smiled at it. That is, a deafening sound suddenly burst forth. The fourfold acceleration of Yu's steps burst forth from the giant wolf's unreasonable muscles. Its four limbs instantly trampled on the ground, leaving deep depressions. The giant wolf had also broken through the sound barrier and suddenly appeared. It was already close at hand, and a cold whisper sounded in the giant owl's ears. "One is worth two." Instinctively, the giant owl screamed and used phase jump again. Before the giant sword could cut it in half, a broken bone wing and a small part of its body fell from the sky, and its figure had already disappeared. 8 o'clock. Fu Yi's voice sounded in Huaishir's consciousness at the right time. Then, the giant wolf that was running forward turned without warning. It pounced at the confused giant owl hundreds of meters away. "You want to leave after offending the prince?" Chapter 346. Tai Hui, who was galloping in the air, outlined a sharp angle. Relying on his own exaggerated muscle strength and steps, he trampled on the common sense of physics in an unscientific manner. In an instant, he bore the pressure of nearly double the acceleration and shot backward. He pounced straight at the giant owl that had just flashed out of the air. His speed didn't slow down at all. In fact, relying on the momentum of breaking through the original inertia, his speed exploded again, faster than before, charging or retreating as the process of accumulating momentum. This was the perfect U-steps technique. Crow rides a plane. In the reflection of the giant owl's suddenly contracted pupils, Huaishi's long tail swayed. The giant sword tore through the air, bursting with a burning brilliance. As the wolf beast roared, it slashed down again. Embarrassing, leave the group. Drummer. The heavenly drum in the void seemed to have been beaten in an instant, bursting with thunder. Purely relying on his unreasonable muscle strength, Huaishi's rough technique actually burst forth with astonishing explosive power comparable to Elder Luo's. The strength of his whole body was superimposed on the sword, causing the sword to instantly vibrate like a bee's wings. It swept past. The mutated giant owl froze in place. It lowered its head in shock and found that it seemed to be intact. Could it be that the phase jump just now was successful? Immediately after, it noticed a thick smell of iron emerging from its lungs when it breathed. From its mouth and nose, a sharp iron light burst forth and spread out from the inside out. It exploded out of thin air. Blood spurted out from the body that was riddled with holes, dyeing the entire giant wolf blood red. One-hit kill. Then, a hidden arrow suddenly came out of nowhere. Just as Huaishi was about to achieve victory, the arrows hidden in the darkness silently burst forth, perfectly taking advantage of his momentary lapse in concentration. After accumulating strength for an unknown period of time, the arrow tore through Huaishi's scales like a hot knife through butter and nailed deep into his neck. It was very close to Huaishi's carotid artery. Well, it was about 20 centimeters away. It was just the distance of a Xinyue member. What a pity. The blood-soaked ferocious wolf beast had already sensed the origin of the hidden arrow. The hidden arrow hanging from its neck turned around indifferently and looked at the other side of the battlefield, at the centaur that thought it had succeeded. Huaishi grinned and revealed a kind smile. His lips opened and closed as he silently greeted it. I saw you. In the blink of an eye, the gigantic centaur was terrified and turned to flee into the city behind it. A group of elves with pointy ears and covered in armor hid it behind the formation, providing cover for it without regard for their own safety. But no matter how he thought about it, he would probably be defeated by the giant wolf, right? The centaur didn't care how many of them died. It didn't even care if they all died. It just wanted to escape because the bone-chilling cold was getting closer and closer. Throwing away the cumbersome giant iron bow, it ran with all its might towards the open city gate in front of it. As long as it escaped inside, it would be safe. However, a scream suddenly sounded behind him. Then it suddenly disappeared. It was so fast. What replaced it was a dead silence. A chill that erupted from his consciousness froze him in place, making him unable to move. He felt fear crawl up his spine like a crawling insect. Then a chilling greeting sounded in its ears. Sister. A wolf head poked out from behind its arm. Its eyes, which were the size of a human head, glanced at it and said with interest, Who are you sniping? Why sure, we're all from the astronomy club. We're on the same side. Don't do it. At the critical moment, the Emperor's penguin, twin moons, finally rushed over and said anxiously, Don't kill her. I can give you key information in exchange. Several big spirits followed closely behind. The giant beast's murderous intent locked onto Huaishi, forcing him to make a decision. What information? I'm quite interested. Huaishi looked back at him and seemed to have changed his mind. He grinned and smiled, but I prefer to kill my own people. Twin Moon's expression changed instantly. He activated his psychokinesis and fought with Fu Yi in the void, but it was too late. Huaishi took a deep breath. Snitch's breath, stage 9. Metal breath. The terrifying breath, which was one of the most powerful skills of all explorers, instantly drowned the centaur and turned her into a charred corpse covered in a metal film. She didn't even have time to scream. Then, blood spurted out from Huaishi's body. He roared into the sky. In this short period of time, Huaishur had once again ushered in an evolution. In a moment of trance, darkness suddenly appeared in front of his eyes. It was as if a crack leading to the abyss had opened in front of him. Pairs of malicious eyes stared at Huaishur. Wherever his gaze passed, deep resentment and darkness appeared from Huaishur's soul, inflicting distortion. A huge amount of despair, pain, and madness poured into Huaishur's soul. Burp. Huaishur moaned comfortably and stared at the abyss expectantly. Is there more? Majimoto. The countless pairs of eyes in the abyss were stunned for a moment, then looked away awkwardly. Mom, there's a pervert here. The crack in the void suddenly closed up, as if it had never appeared. Huaishur opened his eyes and heard a series of incessant crackling sounds. On his back and the joints of his limbs, sharp, metal-like blades suddenly popped out, as if he was wearing a metal armor that was full of barbs and sharp blades. A living killing machine. Pate. Huaishur spat on the ground and reached out to flatten it, making a mirror. He looked around and sighed. I've become more handsome again, as expected of me. As he spoke, the huge wolf head slowly raised and looked at the giant beasts around him with a sneer. His gaze fell on Twin Moon's face. Kid, do you want a mask? It's free. Without saying anything, Twin Moon rose into the air and suddenly shrank behind his teammates. From Huaishur's completely empty skull, he read undisguised ferocity and killing intent, as well as that indescribable malice. It was as if the abyss had opened in front of him. Do it, he roared loudly. Okay. Huaishur nodded. In an instant, he shot through the air, raised his tail, and swung his large sword in a circle, aiming for Twin Moon's skull. Bang! A formless telekinesis forcefully blocked this sword, but the axe of Wrath's attack on Origin Substance had unquestionably taken effect on his body. It was as if someone had swung a hammer at his head with all their might. Twin Moon fell from the sky. Blood seeped out of his mouth, nose, and eyes. As for his ears, in any case, Huaishur didn't know where a penguin's ears were. Ignoring the attacks of the other giant beasts, Huaishur took advantage of his weakness to take his life. Huaishur once again swung the blade on his tail and slashed. At the critical moment, a giant beast that looked like a pterodactyl raised its wings, blocking the sword like a tower shield. Sparks flew, and the pterodactyl's eyelids twitched wildly. The membrane on its wing was instantly pierced, and a large hole was torn open, as if a piece of craft paper had been pierced. Even worse, it felt as if its blood was being continuously sucked away by that strange large sword, becoming a beautiful embossment and decoration on the sword's spine. It was difficult to breathe. Ignoring the attacks of the giant bull and tiger, Huaishur swung the blade again and slashed. Half of its wing flew into the sky, and the pterodactyl cried out in pain. Huaishur once again sucked in a deep breath. F***, why was this bastard's breath cool down so quickly? Everyone retreated in fear, only to see Huaishur burp in satisfaction. He grinned, revealing a mocking smile at them. Don't be afraid, I'm just kidding. The wolf beast stepped forward, using the fourth layer of the Emperor Yu's steps, and the tip of its sword swept horizontally. The winged white tiger instantly let out a mournful cry, and blood spurted out. Immediately afterwards, a formless telekinesis pierced into its eye sockets, directly piercing through its brain. Die. Immediately afterwards, Huaishur was bathed in the white tiger's blood, and he was almost within reach. The pterodactyl roared angrily, spitting out a dark green rain of acid. Even steel began to sizzle under the corrosion of this strong acid. Its open mouth didn't even have time to close before it was forced open by Huaishur. You like to vomit. Huaishur observed its throat and skillfully opened its mouth. Toei. Between the iron claws, the pterodactyl's mouth was forcibly closed. The giant beast struggled frantically, and smoke rose from its face. It was really thick smoke, as if its flesh was being burnt. When it was thrown to the ground by Huaishur, half of its head was already cooked, emitting a tempting fragrance. It was a pity that there wasn't the crying of the child next door to set off the atmosphere. but it wasn't bad to have a penguin chirping. Huaishur observed Twin Moon's shocked expression with great interest, slowly moving forward step by step. There were other beasts that wanted to come over, but they were forced to retreat by the gaze of the wolf beast. On the huge battlefield, this place was empty. The formless telekinesis pulled the surrounding air, forming sharp spikes, sealing off Twin Moon's space to dodge, forcing it into a desperate situation. Wait a minute, Huaishur, let's make a deal. Twin Moon didn't panic, and it could be said to be fearless in the face of danger. Instead, it said, I'm willing to exchange information about this witch's night as long as you're willing to listen to me. Don't you know about the information about the destructive factor? Oh, the rancher, right? Huaishur stepped forward indifferently. Now that you mention it, I can probably guess it. Don't tell me you want to use this in exchange for your life. Being killed here will only result in me withdrawing. You can't kill me, so what's the point of exchanging my life? Twin Moon replied calmly. If I tell you that it's not just the rancher involved here, do you still plan to continue listening? Huaishur paused for a moment, stunned. This grandson couldn't be fooling him, right? If the abyss evolution theory could be related to the rancher, he would know, but how could the witch's dream involve another destructive factor? There were a total of 24 destructive factors, and one experiment accounted for 2. Were all the creators of the utopia so careless? At that moment, Huaishur suddenly felt a premonition of death activate, and his whole body turned cold. Without hesitation, he turned around and ran straight up the Lizardman city wall. He didn't care about anything and looked around vigilantly. He didn't know where this premonition of death came from. Twin Moon was also stunned. Although it didn't know why Huaishur didn't even want the information and turned around to leave, its first reaction after escaping death was to quickly return to the city. As soon as it took a step, it heard it. A distant song sounded above its head. The heavy chirp was like a song, mellow and hoarse, full of pain and sorrow. A gloomy song was played in the sky. It suddenly descended on the battlefield. Chapter 347. At that moment, the sky cracked, and a huge shadow was reflected on every sluggish face. As the venomous skylight slanted like a torrent, hundreds of huge spots appeared on the scorched and withered land. Those spots swam in the desert, the swamps, the poisonous pools, and even the decaying cities and every terrified face. They gathered into a formation and slowly swam forward amidst the sorrowful and gloomy song. They were gigantic whales, decaying, expanding, and even growing abnormally. The deformed whales, which were covered in layers of dendrobium, strange eyes, and twisted faces, revealed their despairingly enormous bodies in the sky. They cried loudly, and their voices overlapped with each other, turning into a vast and desolate song. When they shook their bodies, they set off a whistling hurricane. They just shook off the dust. When the dust fell to the ground, it became a stinking rain. It swallowed up everything in the world. An indescribable precipitate of the abyss dissipated from it, causing the eyes of all the members of the Astronomical Association and the depth index on their plugins to jump wildly. Just a few drops fell on Huaishur's body, and his iron armor began to sizzle and rust rapidly, giving him a fright. But soon, a layer of psychokinesis barrier propped up from his body, isolating him from the rain. The great spirits on the battlefield were not so lucky. For a moment, they jumped and fled in all directions. Some of them had evolutionary defects or showed signs of being parasitized and even began to deform on the spot. The scattered herds attracted the attention of the horrifying whales in the sky. Suddenly, the smallest whale swooped down, bringing with it a fishy wind. Huaishur only felt that the hurricane was about to overturn him. As it approached, the sad song changed, becoming like a vicious mockery from the abyss. It was a whale laughing at them. It was laughing at all the ants in the world. It looked at their struggling faces, sympathized with their eventual destruction, and mocked their worthless resistance. Even the smallest whale on the ground had the power to collapse a building when it swooped down. Compared to it, even Huaishur's huge body was as small as a doll. The giant whale rushed into the battlefield, brushing against the wall. With a swing of its long tail, it casually turned half of the city wall into ruins, and gravel flew everywhere. Huaishur and the others frantically retreated. When they finally had a chance to look back, the whale had rushed into the sky again. Only the devastated battlefield was left. The great spirits that were still in the crevice had been reduced by at least half. Countless arrogant giant beasts had been swallowed by the whales, ushering in their destruction. The battle of the eternal world that had just begun came to a temporary end, just like that. In the dead silence, only vicious laughter and sad whale songs gradually faded away. Huaishur stared blankly at the whales that had become small black dots. He lowered his head stiffly and looked at the high priest kneeling beside him, trembling and crying. "What is that?" The bell of destruction. The bell of destruction. The high priest shrieked and cried. "That is the evil creature created by the devil, the herdsman who sowed destruction on the earth. God, is it God who wants to destroy this world? Why? Why do you have to give us such a painful punishment? Are you punishing us for our original sin?" No matter how many times he asked, all he could mutter were scriptures and prayers. Huaishur's patience ran out, but he could not get any useful information. This group of lizard men was really too much. Great spirits, the sacred beasts that protect the kingdom. A hoarse voice sounded in the ears of every surviving giant beast of the lizard men. It sounded familiar. That voice sounded like it was dying, and it used up all its strength just to breathe. "Please come to me." Huaishur and the surviving great spirits looked at each other in shock, and finally remembered that it seemed to be the king's voice. They looked at the capital bathed in the vicious rain behind them, and the silent hall. As the door opened with a bang, the giant beasts once again walked into the hall that was full of decadence. But as the curtains were pulled up, everyone was stunned. On the throne, the old man who should have been dying actually recovered a little bit of vitality, and a faint light shone in his turbid eyes. Even though his breathing still carried the muddy sound from his lungs, his complexion was strangely rosy, as if he had eaten to his heart's content. It was completely different from yesterday's decline. Instead, it was as if he had just recovered from a serious illness. He was gradually recovering in the rain of the abyss. This eerie scene made everyone's heart tremble. I'm sure everyone already knows what exactly happened. On the throne, the decrepit old man said bluntly, "I think this country know this world is not going to live for long. The end is coming, and everything will be destroyed." Behind him, on the altar, the eye of the god skeleton that seemed to be alive trembled slightly, as if it was looking at the faces of every beast. The beast was ferocious. "But the war," after a short pause, he gathered his strength and said with difficulty, "The war is not over. The eternal war must continue," he said. It said, "We can't stop struggling either." On the face of the decrepit lizard man, the turbid eyes lit up with a chilling fanaticism. "Even if everything will be destroyed in the destruction." The withered finger slowly raised and pointed at Huaishur in the midst of the beasts. "Great Spirit, please come forward. Accept this gift from the gods," said the king. "It is a reward you deserve." Huaishur's first reaction was to turn around and leave. He felt that there would be no good juice to eat at this time. He was quite clear about his position as a tool man, no, a tool dog. They were just in a cooperative relationship. He could not even stomach it, let alone his heart. At this time, if the other side wanted to do some strange sacrificial ritual and wanted to do something desperate, Huaishur would not doubt it at all. But after hesitating for a long time, he still walked forward in the end. There was still a good brother here. At most, he would swallow this bastard, take the divine remains, and run away. Would anyone be able to catch up with him? As the wolf beast approached, a pair of cold amber eyes scrutinized the king who was close at hand, guarding against any rash movements. Then he saw it. The king began to tremble rapidly. As if he had taken drugs, his eyes turned white, and his limbs twitched. Then, with the connection of the blood thread, an increasingly large, violent, bestial nature emerged from the narrow body. It was as if the will of the divine remains had entered its aged body. It caused the shell that was on the verge of collapse to multiply and change on its own. Countless scales peeled off and regrew. An eyeball exploded with a bang. In the empty eye socket, clusters of nauseating granules wriggled. The aberration of the abyss descended on its body, but it was forcibly calmed down, and a blood-colored crystal the size of a grain of sand appeared in its hand. A sweet aura spread out. It caused all the beasts present to make hungry sounds and their eyes to turn red. In that moment, Huaisher suddenly understood. He abruptly raised his head and looked at the eyeball on the altar. This was probably the true use of the divine remains, right? The group of idiots who wanted to take the divine remains and run had never thought about why the lizardmen dared to place the divine remains in front of them so casually. The entire city, the king, and the divine remains had long since been connected. None of them could be missing. The city would collect the origin substance from the abyss and infuse it into the divine remains, while the king would bathe in this excessively violent grace and strip away the aberrated parts of the abyss from his own body. What remained would be the crystallization of the divine grace that would no longer be tainted by the abyss. Now, the king didn't need to do anything. The crystal of divine grace flew up on its own and entered Huaisher's body. Huaisher raised his hand, patted it, and stuffed it directly into the bell. The enormous body blocked most of the view. Only the king witnessed everything, but he didn't say anything. He only glanced at Su Chun with a smile that wasn't a smile. Under the wrinkled and broken skin, brand new scales had actually grown. He was coming back from the dead. No, it should be said that from a dying lizard man, he was gradually turning into something else. The moment he truly came back to life, perhaps all the hidden dangers would completely erupt at that time, right? He would become the most powerful beast in this country. At the same time, he would also be the most corrosive species, the representative of the abyss on the surface. He could almost be called the leader of a large group. A leader of a large group in the midst of transformation. This made Huaisher want to make a move several times, but he couldn't make up his mind. "You have a problem?" the king asked. "What is the purpose of everything you do?" Huaisher was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he asked, "Or is there really any meaning to it? Since the end of the world was coming, then all of this would be completely destroyed. No matter how much they struggled in vain, there was no meaning to what they were doing. No matter if it was their country, the capital, or this palace, they would all be swept away from the earth when the time came. All of this was just a hasty dream of the Creator." Meaning, the lizard man king raised the corner of his mouth with difficulty. He seemed to be mocking himself. "I thought, ants like us, whether we exist or not, is not meaningful at all. What is the meaning? To live? Or to live better? Rights? Wealth? Fame? Or perhaps he would become a supreme existence, leaving a unique monument. Those are all meanings. Great spirits, but for us, they are not," he replied with a hoarse voice. "Existence for us. Existence is the meaning of everything. We won't exist." It said, "We will exist." When the old king, who was wandering between aging and death, aberration and evolution, made such a declaration, his turbid eyes burst out with chilling obsession and determination. It said, "We will definitely exist." Chapter 348. After answering Huaisher's question, the king continued to give out his rewards. Other than Huaisher, there were a total of 4 other great spirits who received gifts from the gods. They evolved on the spot. A crystal of divine grace was equivalent to a precious metamorphosis. Jonathan had been squatting at the side from the beginning to the end. His eyes were wide open, and he had probably even turned on the recording function. He carefully scanned the changes in each of the great spirits and recorded the various data of the godly remains. His hand kept on swiping in void space as if he was suffering from epilepsy. After the award ceremony ended, Huaisher pulled him into his temple without a word. With a wave of his claw, the heavy stone door of the temple slammed shut. Then, Huaisher scrutinized the stunned Jonathan, circling him until a hint of panic appeared in his calm expression. He suddenly slapped his claw. Son of AB asterisk TCH. You've been exposed. He scolded angrily. Tell me honestly, what exactly are you hiding from me? Nothing at all. Jonathan widened his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. Why, sure. You have to believe me. If that's the case, then that penguin is coaxing me? Or is there some information from the Astronomy Association that he knows, but you don't? Why bit his teeth and grinned. Are we going through the process or going straight to the torture? Old Joe, if you have anything to say, you'd better say it directly. Otherwise, it won't look good on us if we fall out. Jonathan was about to say something else when he heard a bang. The great sword with the axe of fury attached to it slashed behind him, just a little bit away from the tip of the tail that was shaking uneasily. It was bone-chilling. I advise you to think about it before you speak. Why advised seriously. Here, it's not forbidden to harm allies. I want to quit. Jonathan hesitated for a long time before he suddenly made up his mind. Okay, if you don't feel bad about the data of the gods' remains, I'll send you on your way now. Huaishi's tail curled around the sword and began to gesture on his body. Do you like to be beheaded, cut in half, or cut in half from head to tail? To be honest, decapitation is the most satisfying, but the most exciting thing is to cut it open from the middle. You will have the illusion that you have become two people, and there will be double the pain. I recommend this. Jonathan's face twitched. Don't scare me. It's all true. Huaishi grinned. I've experienced it myself. I don't mind letting you experience it a few times. The Continuation Academy, right? Do you think it's a big deal for an official of the Governor's Bureau to beat up a geologist from the Continuation Institute? Both online and offline, he struck hard. When Huaishi's threat was clearly thrown in front of Jonathan, he finally lost his courage and chose to confess. That was why it was said that these keyboard warriors would not know their place if they were not taught a lesson. As Huaishi scratched his sword and sparks burst out, Jonathan quickly explained the matter clearly. The factor of destruction, the beast of eternal life? The bumpkin Huaishi was stunned. What's that? This is the part of the secret list that has not been announced yet, and the part that the Continuation Institute is responsible for. Once he opened his mouth, Jonathan simply told him everything in detail. For most people, this is a secret. However, my former teacher, Sheikh, was also a creator. His field of expertise was the origin of life. Once, I saw a very strange biological formula in my teacher's place. You don't understand what I mean by strange. It's, don't keep me in suspense and don't talk about those fancy things. Huaishi put his sword directly on his neck, interrupting his impulse to talk. If you have something to say, say it. Well, it's the law of blood pressure balance, but it hasn't been applied to the reality grand arcanum. The specific effect is actually similar to the one used today, but the strange thing is the format and other expansion modules are completely different from everything that exists, as if they are used to match another creature. It's too strange. So just say it. Well, that's the research results obtained from the beast of eternal life. Before Jonathan could pave the way for the atmosphere, Huaishi, the one who spoiled the mood, directly revealed the spoiler. The beast of eternal life? Huaishi chewed on the name, confused. Yes, it's the one you're thinking of. In the current research, it's the only existence that has obtained eternal life, Jonathan said straightforwardly. According to the analysis and speculation of the instrument, its lifespan is as long as 9. For a million years or even longer, and we have no way to continue the analysis. In short, as long as it doesn't die, it can always live. And before the secret forces of the Continuation Institute found it, it had already lived in this world for 4,000 years. For 1,000 years? Not to mention the lifespan that could be said to be endless. Just the span of 4,000 years was enough to make Huaishi dumbfounded. How long was the life of an ordinary person? Even those who were lucky and had a long lifespan were no more than 100 years old. Ascendants could live up to 300 or 400 years old. But even the most powerful natural enemy, or even the former gods, had a lifespan of only 1,000 years. 1,000 years, this number was the average that Crow personally guaranteed. No matter how much they racked their brains to escape, used long sleep and deep sleep to prevent the arrival of aging, or how grand the sacrifices were made. After 1,000 years, it would vanish into thin air. No matter what kind of existence it was, in the end, it was a handful of yellow soil, not worth mentioning. But now, someone was telling Huaishur that there was a thing that had lived for more than 4,000 years. Moreover, he would continue to live until 9. For a million years later, would he still be able to continue living? Huaishur was in disbelief. Such an awesome thing. How did you find it? It wasn't us who found it. Jonathan smiled bitterly. It was one day it took the initiative to appear in front of the headquarters of the Continuation Institute and found us. For what? Huaishur was stunned. Walking into a trap? Something like that. Jonathan scratched his face, somewhat in disbelief. It is willing to cooperate with all the research of the Continuation Institute and give everything it has to the Astronomy Society for free and even more. Facing the negotiators of the Astronomy Society, the immortal existence, who was identified as one of the elements that could destroy the world, made its only request. It said, "Completely destroy me, kill me, and obliterate me from this world without leaving a single cell." Huaishur was silent. He suddenly remembered what Crow once said to him. In a long time, even the gods would be bored to the point of suicide, let alone mortals. The vastness and magnificence of this world were relative to ordinary people. Boundless mysteries and boundless explorations were only available to a limited number of living beings. For some beings, an excessively long life was tantamount to a cage. Death, on the other hand, was nothing more than an eternal destination. For some reason, Huaishur actually felt that its request was not strange, and even pitiful. "You're not surprised at all?" Jonathan asked. "Why should I be surprised? There are many people who want to commit suicide, and it's not a big deal to have an element of destruction." Huaishur shook his head. "Or rather, it's just that it has lived a little longer. It would be strange if it was regarded as an element of destruction, right? You're still too young." Jonathan shook his head and sighed. He was too young to understand how terrifying the attraction of immortality was to some people. In this regard, in the present realm, no matter what kind of politician, tycoon, ascendant, or even creator had to pay respect to the Astronomy Society. Even though it was no longer as glorious as it used to be, it had many drawbacks, shortcomings, and even directly interfered with the operation of the present realm to some extent. But the Astronomy Society still abided by its duties. Whether it was the Directorate of Governance, which was regarded as increasingly muddle-headed and decaying, the Continuation Institute, which was regarded as muddle-headed and conservative, which obstructed the development of technology, or even the technical department, which secretly monopolized the present realm's technical standards. Even so, they still fulfilled their duties, and no one could do it better than them. The true core research about the beast of eternal life was all perfectly sealed in the headquarters of the Continuation Institute, and there was no leakage of the slightest bit. To this day, the present realm was still perfectly isolated from all the elements of destruction. The Astronomy Society's contribution to the normal operation of the human world was indispensable. In other words, when Huaishur came to his senses, he finally understood the situation. This Night of the Witch is actually studying the two elements of destruction, the rancher and the beast of eternal life. And you already knew about it and didn't tell me at all? The wolf beast's eyes flashed with a fierce light. "Wait, this is all speculation and analysis, okay? It's not certain at all." Jonathan raised his paw awkwardly. "This is just the result of some discussion in the group. At present, there is no evidence that directly links this place to the rancher and the beast of eternal life." Huaishur grinned, revealing a mouthful of sharp teeth, and looked down at him. "When there is evidence, will you think it's too late?" Did he think he was too young or too inexperienced? He had been in so many horror movies. How could he not know that when the unlucky bastard found out that there was really a ghost in the house he bought, it would be too late to run even if he wanted to? How could there be such an iron-headed idiot who knew that there was a ghost in the mountain and still insisted on going there? If one hears the truth in the morning, one can die in the evening. Jonathan straightened his neck and actually dared to talk back. You don't understand. Believe it or not, I'll kill you right now. Huaishur was furious and glared at him. You King came here to let you hear the truth? I came here to let you send Fu Yi out. In the end, not only did you King laze around, you also want to hear the truth. I'll fart for you to smell, okay? This bastard actually wanted to sell him out, but he actually wanted to sell Fu Yi out as well. What the hell was he thinking? Listen, Huaishur, I understand that you are very angry. Jonathan was also terrified. He raised his paw in surrender and explained, but you have to believe in the Astronomy Association. The safety of this system is absolutely not a problem. Cough, cough. At least this kind of scholar-only version is not a problem. No matter what happens, Fu Yi can be sent out immediately, I promise. Your system can guarantee my ass. Huaishur tilted his head and spat out a mouthful of hot saliva. If it's really safe, then she shouldn't have been sent in. As he spoke, he raised his big sword and pointed it directly at Jonathan. We'll talk about other things later, he said solemnly. Now, immediately send Fu Yi out. Fu Yi, come out, let Fu Yi. Fu Yi. A minute later, Huaishur lowered his head in shock, his eyes wide open as he looked at the empty bell around his neck. Oh my god, this is bad. Where did his good brother go? You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.